The story that changed everything was told over a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the low light of a pub fire as peat smoke clung to the air. Alistair MacLeod had been listening to his old friend Ewan describe a weekend spent in a remote Highland glen. It wasn't the beauty of the place Ewan focused on, but the silence, a thick, watchful quiet that had been pierced, just once, by the sound of his own name whispered from an empty stretch of moor. The casual terror in Ewan's normally steady voice, the way his hand had tightened around his glass, planted a seed in Alistair's mind that quickly took root. For years, Alistair had made a modest living as a freelance writer, crafting articles on travel and history for various magazines. He documented the surfaces of places, the best viewpoints, the oldest pubs, the dates of battles. But Ewan's account spoke of something deeper, a layer of memory etched not in stone but in the very atmosphere. The Highlands were littered with such tales, fragments of tragedy and loss that refused to settle. What if someone sought them out, not as a ghost hunter with meters and gadgets, but as a chronicler? What if he listened and wrote down what the land remembered? The idea, once conceived, became an obsession. He spent weeks in his cramped Inverness flat, surrounded by maps and historical texts, compiling a list of locations. Glencoe, with its bloody history and reports of spectral voices. The bleak moor of Culloden. The mist-shrouded slopes of Ben Macdui. Each site was a knot of sorrow, a place where the past seemed thin, like worn cloth. His proposal for a book, tentatively titled Echoes in the Heather, A Journey Through Haunted Highlands, was met with cautious interest from a publisher. It was enough. The call, silent but insistent, had been heard. On the morning of his departure, a fine, persistent drizzle veiled the city. Alistair packed his car with a deliberate focus that bordered on ritual, his laptop and digital recorder were nestled beside a sturdy leather-bound journal, its pages blank and waiting. A high-quality camera, a tripod, and an assortment of lenses were carefully secured. He included practicalities too, a well-worn tent, a sleeping bag rated for mountain cold, a portable stove, and packets of instant coffee. Lastly, he placed a small, smooth stone from the River Ness on the dashboard, a talisman of sorts, a piece of the land he was setting out to interrogate. As he drove west out of Inverness, leaving the last suburbs behind, the city's grey stone gave way to the overwhelming green of the countryside. The road narrowed, winding alongside lochs that lay like polished slate under the heavy sky. Ancient mountains, their peaks lost in cloud, rose on either side, shoulders hunched against time. A familiar thrill of adventure warmed his chest, the same he'd felt on previous assignments. But beneath it, coiling like the mist in the valleys below, was a thread of apprehension. He was not just going to see these places, he was going to wait for them, in the dark, and ask them to speak. He was seeking proof of whispers, of shadows, of grief that had outlived the bones that first felt it. The engine hummed, the wipers beat a steady rhythm, and Alistair MacLeod drove deeper into the landscape, a scribe heading voluntarily into the realm of ghosts. The road into Glencoe did not feel like an entrance, but a descent. The great, brooding shoulders of the mountains, Bourchaille-Etive Moor and the Three Sisters, closed in around the winding tarmac, their slopes scarred by ancient landslides and draped in veils of low, shifting cloud. Alistair parked at a lay-by, the silence upon cutting the engine absolute and heavy, as if the very air was holding its breath. This was a place of terrible beauty, where the grandeur of nature was underscored by a profound, echoing sadness. The Glen of Weeping lived up to its name long before the infamous massacre. It was a landscape that seemed bred for tragedy. He shouldered his pack, the weight of his gear a comforting anchor, and began to hike a well-trodden path along the valley floor. The river code chattered coldly over stones to his left, a bright, busy sound that only emphasized the deep quiet of the towering rock walls. His research had been clear. For decades, hikers and climbers had reported the same bizarre, chilling phenomenon. Not apparitions or cold spots, but a voice. A clear, familiar voice, calling their name from the mist or the crags, a sound that tricked the mind and lured the unwary off safe paths. It was this specific, intimate haunting that had drawn him here first. After a few miles, he found the small, rustic guiding office near the Clackaig Inn, a low building of stone and weathered timber. Inside, the air smelled of damp wool and peat smoke. The man behind the counter, introduced as Donnan, had a face like the surrounding landscape, etched with deep lines, his eyes the color of the slate-grey locks. He was a man who knew these hills in their every mood. When Alistair explained his purpose, a knowing, weary look passed over Donnan's features. He agreed to talk, gesturing to a pair of worn leather chairs by a cold fireplace. Donnan spoke not of the 1692 massacre first, but of the mountains themselves. He described them as living entities, old and patient, and indifferent to the small, brief lives that scrambled over their backs. The voices, he said, were part of the glen's fabric, as much as the rain or the heather. But they were not ancient. He leaned forward, his voice dropping into a low, steady rhythm. He told Alistair of a young man, a skilled climber from Glasgow named Callum, who had come to conquer the Eonach Ridge a dozen years prior. It was a clear autumn day, perfect conditions. Callum was last seen by his partner, who had turned back with a twisted ankle, waving from a prominent outcrop. Then a freak, localized fog had boiled up from the corries, swallowing the ridge whole. In minutes. When it cleared, Callum was gone. A massive, week-long search found nothing. His body was discovered the following spring by a shepherd, in a remote sheer gully far from any logical route. But here's the thing, Donnan said, his gaze fixed on the empty grate. The searches stopped in winter, the snows came. Yet two separate parties, experienced winter climbers, reported hearing a shout for help from that same gully in January. A clear young male voice. They went to look, found nothing but wind-scoured ice, and since then, it's changed. The voice doesn't call for help anymore. It learns, it listens. Hikers say they hear their own names or a friend's voice coming from the mist on the path ahead. It sounds so real you'd swear on your mother's life someone is there. A few have followed, lured off-trail onto dangerous ground. They all say the same thing. It sounded so friendly, so certain. Donnan sat back, the story hanging in the quiet room. The historical weight of the glen's slaughter, he implied, had perhaps created a receptive silence, a wound in the atmosphere. Callum's modern tragedy, his desperate loneliness and confusion in that final whiteout, had seeped into it. His spirit wasn't replaying his death, it was lost, endlessly trying to make contact, using the echoes of the living to find its way, and in doing so, leading them astray. Alistair left the office with his notes feeling heavier. The afternoon light was already fading, staining the high peaks a bruised purple. The mist was thickening, creeping down from the high corries like a slow grey tide. As he walked back towards his car, the cheerful rush of the river seemed to mute, absorbed by the immense, watching silence of the glen. He found himself straining his ears, not just for a voice but for the absence of one. The story was no longer just research, it was a presence. Somewhere in the gathering gloom, a lost climber was still wandering, and his voice was now a part of the wind, the water, the very mist that began to curl around Alistair's boots, cold and insistent. The mist that had been a distant veil on the peaks now filled the glen floor, a tangible, damp shroud that swallowed sound and distance. Alistair chose his campsite with a practicality that felt increasingly hollow, a relatively flat patch of grass near the river, sheltered by a low outcrop of rock. The routine of pitching his tent, of hammering pegs into the soft, peaty earth, was a comforting anchor in the creeping unreality. Each metallic thunk was a declaration of the present, a rebuttal to the story Donnan had woven. But as he worked, the silence pressed in, no longer empty but thick and listening. The cheerful chatter of the river cow seemed muffled, as if flowing through wool. Darkness fell not with a sunset, but with a deepening of the grey. The world shrank to the small amber circle of his headlamp and the faint glow of his portable stove as he boiled water for a meagre dinner. He ate quickly, the food tasteless, his ears tuned to frequencies beyond the wind. He documented his impressions in his journal, the pen scratching loudly in the quiet. Atmosphere, profound isolation. Sensory deprivation due to mist. Prime conditions for auditory pareidolia, the mind creating patterns from white noise. He wrote the words, but they felt like a flimsy shield. He zipped himself into the tent, into the synthetic enclosed smell of nylon and sleeping bag. The darkness outside was absolute, a blackness so complete it felt solid. He lay in his bag, recorder placed carefully beside his pillow, its red ready, light a single watchful eye. For a long time there was only the sound of his own breathing and the distant, eternal sigh of water over stone. He focused on it, counting the rhythms, trying to lull himself towards sleep. It began not as a sound, but as a pressure, a subtle shift in the quality of the silence, as if the air itself had thickened. Then a whisper, not from one direction, but from everywhere and nowhere, woven into the fabric of the mist. It was faint, a breath of syllables without form. Alistair froze, his own breath held. The wind, he told himself, water over a peculiar stone. The whisper came again, slightly clearer, a sibilant rush that circled the tent. It held no words he could decipher, only a cadence that felt horribly like speech. His heart began a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He reached for the recorder, his fingers clumsy, and pressed record. The tiny red light glowed steadily. He lay back down, every muscle taut. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity. The whispers subsided, leaving a silence that now felt like a held breath. Then, clear as a bell, a voice spoke his name. Alistair. It came from just outside the tent flap, a man's voice, calm and familiar. It sounded like Ewan, the friend who had started him on this path. The tone was conversational, welcoming even. A jolt of pure electric terror shot down his spine. His mind screamed pareidolia, suggestion, wind. But his primal hindbrain knew better. It knew the voice had intent. He did not move, did not breathe. The urge to call out, to answer, was a physical pull in his throat. He clenched his jaw until it ached. Donnan's warning echoed. It sounds so friendly, so certain. A soft scraping sound followed, like a boot shifting on gravel, right beside his head. Alistair's eyes, wide and straining, were fixed on the tent wall. The mist outside diffused the faint starlight into a uniform, luminous grey. Against this backdrop, a shadow moved. It was faint, a darker patch in the gloom, tall and roughly human-shaped. It paused, as if looking down at the tent. No details were visible, no face, no clothing, just a silhouette of profound loneliness and cold. The figure turned with a slow drifting motion and began to move away, fading into the mist towards the steep slope of the gorge. As it receded, the whisper returned, a susurration of lost words, and within he heard his name once more, this time fainter, a question, fading into the night. The rest of the hours until dawn were a marathon of dread. Every rustle of nylon, every drip of condensation was the prelude to another whisper. He did not sleep. He lay rigid, the recorder's light a tiny sentinel, capturing the empty, whispering dark. The cold seeped through the tent floor and into his bones, a chill that felt older than the stones. When the first pallid light finally seeped through the mist, turning the world from black to a weary grey, it felt like a reprieve. He unzipped the tent with stiff, cold fingers, emerging into a world still shrouded but undeniably real. The grass was silvered with dew. There were no footprints but his own. He played back the recording. Through the hiss of the river and the wind he heard them, the faint circling whispers, the clear, calm utterance of his name. The audio was undeniable. Sitting there in the damp dawn, Alistair MacLeod felt no triumph of documentation, only a deep, hollow cold. He had come to listen, and the glen had spoken. It had known his name. The lost climber was not just a story, he was a presence, a hungry echo in the mist, and he had turned his hollow attention on the chronicler who had come to find him. Packing his gear with numb haste, Alistair knew with chilling certainty that the voice would follow him in his memory, a whisper now permanently lodged in the quiet spaces of his own mind. The road east from Glencoe felt like a journey from one kind of sorrow to another, where the glen's grief was vertical, trapped between soaring cliffs and voiced in intimate deceptive whispers. The tragedy of Culloden Moor was horizontal, vast and silent. Alistair drove under a wide, scudding sky, the mountains gradually receding into rumpled hills and then flattening into the bleak, open expanse near Inverness. The visceral chill of the mist still clung to his bones, but a new weight settled on him as he turned onto the narrow lane leading to the battlefield, a sense of approaching a wound not in rock, but in the earth itself. He parked in the nearly empty lot. A low, modern visitor centre stood respectfully to one side, but it was the moor itself that commanded attention. Alistair stepped out into a biting wind that swept unimpeded across the open ground, carrying the scent of damp peat and crushed heather. Before him stretched a vast, undulating field of muted greens and browns, dotted with simple stone markers. The famous Cumberland stone, a massive, inert boulder, lay like a fallen giant. The place was stark, beautiful in a desolate way, and utterly heavy with absence. It felt less like a piece of preserved history and more like an open grave that had never fully been closed. His research had spoken of phenomena far grander and more terrible than a single whispering voice. Here, visitors and staff alike reported sightings of entire phantom regiments, Highlanders in ragged tartan and redcoats in orderly lines, marching or locked in silent, ghostly combat, particularly on the anniversaries of the battle. Others spoke of hearing the muffled drums, the skirl of pipes choked by distance, the thunderous crash of musket volleys and the screams that followed, all rising from the empty moor on still nights. This was not a personal haunting, but a national one, a traumatic memory replaying on a loop in the collective consciousness of the land. Seeking context more than ghost stories, he entered the visitor centre. It was a hushed space filled with maps, weapons, and sombre displays detailing the brutal, swift destruction of the Jacobite cause on that wet April day in 1746. He was examining a case containing a fragmented broadsword when a calm, measured voice spoke beside him. "It never really ends here, does it?" Alistair turned to find a woman in her late 50s, her hair a practical grey bob, wearing the subtle badge of a historian and guide. Her name was Moira, her eyes a sharp blue, held none of the theatrical gloom of a professional purveyor of scares. Instead, they held a deep, weary knowledge. When Alistair explained his project, she nodded slowly, not with surprise but with a kind of resigned recognition. "Come," she said, leading him not back into the exhibits, but through a side door and onto a path that skirted the edge of the moor. They walked in silence for a moment, the wind tugging at their coats. "The facts are in there," she said, nodding toward the center. "The stones out here tell you where they fell. But the moor tells you how it felt." She stopped, gazing across the expanse where the Jacobite line had stood. Her voice dropped, not to a whisper, but to a tone of pure factual recounting, which made her words all the more potent. She told him of a senior custodian, a retired army man not given to fancy, who had been locking up one evening near the anniversary. He saw, in the fading twilight, a line of figures materialize near the old Lennox cottage. They were indistinct, like figures seen through a downpour, but their movements were coordinated, a ragged, stumbling retreat. He heard no sound, but felt a wave of such profound despair and panic that he had to physically steady himself against a wall. Another time, a group of documentary filmmakers with sensitive audio equipment had captured it. On a perfectly calm, clear night, their microphones had picked up a crescendo of sounds, the distant, rhythmic thud of marching feet on soft ground, the metallic clatter of bayonets being fixed, and finally, a single heart-stopping gunshot that echoed across the spectral field before fading into silence. The recording, she said, was in their archives, unexplained and deeply unsettling. "It's not always visual," Moira continued, her eyes scanning the ground as if reading a text only she could see. "Most often, it's a feeling, a sudden, crushing sense of dread that descends for no reason, a wave of cold in a sunny spot. People break down weeping at particular markers, overwhelmed by a grief that isn't their own. The energy of that day, the hope, the fear, the betrayal, the sheer bloody slaughter, was so intense it soaked into the peat. The land remembers the stamp of so many feet, the final cries of so many young men. On certain nights, when the conditions are right, it plays the memory back. As she spoke, Alistair felt it. It was not a voice or a vision, but a palpable heaviness in the air, a resonance that vibrated in the sternum. The wind seemed to carry a faint, discordant hum just at the edge of hearing. He looked across the field at the simple stones marking the clan graves: Fraser, MacGillivray, Mackintosh. Each was a stark punctuation mark in a sentence of utter finality. This was not the confused, lonely spirit of a single climber. This was the echo of an entire world being shattered, a culture gutted on this lonely patch of ground. Moira left him there with a final somber look. "Listen at dusk," she said simply before walking back. Alistair did. He stayed as the orange sun bled out behind the distant hills, staining the clouds the color of old blood. The moor emptied of its few daytime visitors, and the silence returned, deeper and more profound than any he had experienced. He stood near the Fraser stone, his recorder running, his own breath shallow. As the last light failed, the temperature plummeted, and then, on the wind, he heard it, or felt it, a vibration through the soles of his boots, a rhythmic, shuddering thump, thump, thump that was not sound but sensation, as if the earth itself was flinching beneath the memory of thousands of marching feet. The air ahead shimmered, not with heat, but with a strange grey distortion, like a mirage of movement. No clear figures formed, but the impression of a line advancing, of shapes coalescing and dissolving in the gloom, was overwhelming. A metallic taste, like old copper, filled his mouth, a wave of visceral, communal terror, not his own, but borrowed from the past, washed over him, so potent it stole his breath. He did not wait for full darkness. He turned and walked back to the car, his legs unsteady. The experience in Glencoe had been a personal haunting, a ghost-seeking connection. Culloden was different. This was the land itself, hemorrhaging history. He had not seen a ghost, he had felt a nation's death 3 centuries after the fact. As he drove away, the moor receding in his rearview mirror, the weight of it sat in the passenger seat beside him, a silent, spectral companion. The Highlands were not just haunted by ghosts, he realized. They were haunted by time itself, and some wounds in the fabric of things were too deep for time to ever fully heal. The world's most famous lake was a study in stillness under a sky of bruised, low-hanging cloud. Alistair parked his car at a small gravel pull-off on the loch's western shore, far from the tourist bustle of Drumnadroshit. Here, Loch Ness was not a postcard or a monster hunting ground, but a vast, dark mirror, its surface unruffled by wind, reflecting the somber hills and the leaden sky with a perfect, chilling fidelity. The water was the color of cold slate, so deep and opaque it seemed less a liquid and more a solidified slice of night. Everyone came for Nessie, for the thrill of a prehistoric ripple. But Alistair had come for the quieter phantoms, the ones that walked the wooded shores and whispered in the fogs that bred here like living things. He shouldered his pack and walked away from the road, following a faint, muddy path that wound through a dense stand of pine and birch. The air was damp and carried the rich, decaying scent of wet earth and pine needles. His notes spoke not of a plesiosaur, but of shadowy figures. Campers who had pitched tents in these very woods reported waking to see tall, dark shapes moving silently between the trees, never approaching, never receding, just passing through like fragments of a deeper darkness. Others told of a profound, watchful feeling, of being studied by something unseen from the tree line. The further he walked, the more the silence deepened, broken only by the occasional drip of moisture from the branches overhead and the soft sucking sound of his boots in the mud. The loch was a constant heavy presence to his left, visible in glimpses through the trees, a flat, dark plain that seemed to absorb light and sound. He found a small, pebbly beach, a crescent of grey stones worn smooth by the water's cold touch. This was one of the places mentioned, a spot where a family had seen the figures. He sat on a damp log, took out his journal, and simply waited, letting the atmosphere seep into him. The woods were not still. They were full of small movements, the flicker of a bird, the rustle of a vole in the underbrush, but his senses, honed by Glencoe and Culloden, were tuned to a different frequency. He watched the spaces between the trunks, the pools of shadow beneath the dense canopy. For nearly an hour, there was nothing but the natural living woods. Then, a flicker. A patch of darkness at the edge of his vision, 30 yards into the trees, seemed to detach itself from the rest and slide sideways, merging with the shadow of a large pine. It was swift, soundless, and utterly devoid of the jerky, purposeful motion of an animal. It was simply a shift in the pattern of gloom. A cold trickle, unrelated to the damp air, traced a path down his spine. He stared until his eyes ached, but the woods offered no further movement, only their patient green silence. As the afternoon began its slow fade into evening, a mist started to form. It did not roll in from the loch, it was born from it, exhaled from that cold, deep water. Tendrils of white vapor curled up the bank, fingering through the trees, softening edges and swallowing sound. The world shrank to a radius of a few dozen feet. It was time to seek a different kind of story. He packed up and trudged back to the car, driving a few miles south to a tiny, weather-beaten settlement clinging to the shore. The only sign of life was a flickering neon open sign in the window of a pub that looked as if it had grown from the stone of the jetty beside it. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of fried food, ale, and peat smoke. A handful of locals, men with faces carved by wind and water, glanced up from their pints as he entered, their gazes assessing and brief. He ordered a whiskey at the bar, and when the barman, a man with forearms like knotted rope and eyes the color of the loch on a sunless day, brought it. Alistair mentioned he was writing about the area's history, not the monster, he clarified, the other stories. The barman, whose name was Fergus, gave a slow, knowing nod. He gestured with his chin toward an old man sitting alone at a table by the fire, mending a net with gnarled, clever fingers. Talk to Hamish. He's fished these waters since he was a boy. He knows the stories that don't make the pamphlets. Hamish looked up as Alistair approached, his eyes pale and watery but sharp. He didn't smile, but he gestured to the empty chair opposite. Alistair bought him a fresh pint and explained his purpose. For a long moment, Hamish just sipped his beer, his gaze distant, fixed on the flames dancing in the hearth. The crackle of the fire was the only sound. "Aye," Hamish said finally, his voice a dry rustle, like reeds in the wind. "They all want the beastie. But the loch, she holds more than one kind of ghost." He set his pint down with deliberate care. "My father told me this one, and his father before him. It's about a sailor. Not from a warship, just a lad from Fort Augustus who worked the fishing boats, back when the herring still ran thick. His name was Lane, they say, lost in a squall one autumn, a sudden gale that came off the mountains like a fist. Boat went down not 100 yards from shore, but in water so deep and cold it might as well have been a mile down. They never found the body. The loch keeps what she takes." Hamish paused, his fingers still working the net, the motion automatic, a rhythm older than memory. "But on the mornings when the fog is thickest," he continued, his voice dropping, "the kind of fog that sits on the water like a blanket and deadens all sound, he comes back. Not as a dripping corpse, no. He looks almost real. A young man in an old-fashioned oilskin coat, standing on the shore or sometimes on the jetty, peering out into the mist. He doesn't look sad or angry. He looks urgent. According to the tale, the apparition of Lane would raise a hand, not in greeting, but in warning. He would point, sometimes up the loch, sometimes down, sometimes directly across the dark water. Those who had seen him, a handful of fishermen over the generations swearing on their boats, believed he wasn't haunting. He was guarding. He was trying to warn the living of something hidden in that all-consuming fog, a sudden shelf of rock, a treacherous current, an approaching storm unseen in the whiteout, a drowned man forever trapped in the moment of his drowning, trying to prevent others from sharing his fate. "My own cousin," Hamish whispered, leaning in. "Saw him once, 30 years back. Thick fog just before dawn. He was heading out to check his lines. Saw a figure on the old pier, pointing frantically across the water. My cousin thought it was another early riser, turned his boat to go and chat. As he got closer, the figure just faded into the fog. And not 5 minutes later, a deadhead, a huge waterlogged tree trunk, drifted silently through the spot where his boat would have been, would have stove him in for sure. He always swore it was Lane. Said the lad looked right at him, his face pale as the mist, but his eyes were clear. And afraid. Hamish sat back, his story told. He returned to his mending, as if he had simply commented on the weather. Alistair thanked him, the words feeling inadequate. He finished his whiskey, the peat smoke taste now carrying the chill of deep, dark water. Stepping back outside, the night had fully fallen, and the mist was now a true fog, swallowing the world. The lights of the pub were reduced to a fuzzy amber smudge behind him. The loch was invisible, but he could feel its vast, cold presence just beyond the veil. He stood on the shore, the pebbles wet under his feet, and stared into the blinding white. Somewhere out there, in the timeless dark beneath the surface, a young sailor named Lane was forever lost. And on mornings like the one that would come, he would walk again, a spectral sentinel in the fog, silently pointing toward dangers seen only by the dead, a warning from the deep that had become his tomb. The monster was a legend, a thrill, but this was a tragedy, repeated in whispers on the haunted shore. Loch Ness held more than mystery, it held mercy, offered too late by those who knew its deepest, darkest truths. The ruin did not crouch on the shore of Loch Ness so much as erupt from it, a shattered stone fist thrust defiantly into the grey sky. Urquhart Castle's broken silhouette was a jagged scar against the placid dark water, its remaining towers and fragmented walls telling a story of relentless violence, of sieges, betrayals, and a final, deliberate destruction to keep it from Jacobite hands. Alistair parked in the visitor lot, the modern amenities feeling like an impertinence before such ancient, stoic decay. After the intimate terror of Glencoe and the overwhelming sorrow of Culloden, this place promised a different kind of phenomenon, not whispers or marching phantoms, but light. Unexplained, impossible light blooming in windows that had been empty and dark for centuries. He paid his entry and passed through the visitor centre, its displays of medieval life feeling distant and theoretical. The true exhibit lay beyond the glass doors, stepping out onto the path that led down to the castle proper, the full scale of the ruin imposed. Itself, the Grant Tower, the largest remaining structure, stood like a broken tooth, its top sheared off by time or blast. The curtain walls gaped with holes, and the foundations of halls and chapels were mere outlines in the grass, a stone skeleton picked clean by history. Loch Ness stretched behind it, vast and indifferent, its famous depths hiding secrets of its own. The air was cool and carried the clean, damp scent of lake water and old cold stone. Tourists moved in small, murmuring clusters along the prescribed paths, their voices hushed by the atmosphere of monumental decline. Alistair moved among them, but his attention was not on the informational plaques detailing which king besieged which earl. His notebook was open to a different set of facts, modern, anecdotal, and deeply puzzling. The accounts were consistent in their strangeness. Visitors, often those lingering near closing time or observing the castle from the opposite shore at dusk, reported seeing lights in the tower. Not the steady electric glow of modern security lamps, but a flickering golden illumination, like candle or firelight, appearing in the narrow window slits of the upper floors that were roofless, open to the sky, and completely inaccessible. The lights would appear, burn steadily for several minutes, and then vanish, as if snuffed. Sometimes a single window would glow, sometimes several would light in sequence, suggesting a figure moving through the empty space. The castle was rigorously secured after hours, no one could be inside, yet the lights came, witnessed by couples, photographers, and once, notoriously, by a group of skeptical engineers on a boating trip. Alistair climbed the worn steps into the shell of the Grant Tower, the stone under his palms cold and smooth from centuries of touch. He emerged into the hollow core, where grass now grew on what had once been a floor. Looking up, he saw the open sky framed by broken walls. A spiral staircase, partially intact, led to a precarious-looking upper landing. According to the official guide, it was closed for safety, yet this was where the lights were most frequently seen, up there in that skeletal space. He spent the afternoon methodically exploring the bailey, the prison pit, the crumbling gatehouse. He took photographs, not of the scenery, but of sight lines, noting the angles from which the tower windows were visible from the loch and from the surrounding hills. He spoke to a few of the uniformed stewards, polite men and women, who answered questions about history with ease but became reticent, offering only careful, professional smiles when asked about unusual occurrences. One older steward, however, as Alistair lingered near the tower at the end of his shift, paused as he locked a gate. "You're here for the stories," the man stated, not unkindly. He didn't wait for confirmation. "If you want those, don't look to us. We see nothing. But the visitors, they write them down." He nodded toward the visitor center. The comment books, the ones by the exit. People feel the need to put it somewhere official, to prove to themselves they weren't mad. With a final nod, the steward moved on, keys jingling. Alistair took the advice. As the last call echoed over the grounds, he returned to the center. Near the exit, beside a rack of postcards, were several thick, leather-bound volumes with visitor comments embossed on the cover. He opened the most recent one. The pages were a mix of languages and exclamations. Beautiful, so historic. Nessie was shy today, but scattered throughout, written in a variety of hands, some hurried, some deliberate, were the testimonies. He began to read, the modern world fading away as the words painted their eerie, consistent pictures. July 12th, stayed at the B&B across the loch. Last night, around 10:30, saw 3 windows in the top of the big tower light up one after the other. Like someone with a candle was walking through. Told my husband, he saw it. 2. No one is allowed in there at night, are they? M. Peters, Surrey, August 3rd. We were the last to leave the castle grounds. As we walked up to the car park, I turned back for one last photo. The light was fading. I swear I saw a soft yellow light in the middle tower window. It lasted about 10 seconds and went out. My camera didn't pick it up. Felt very strange. K. Lewis, Cardiff. September 18th, fishing after dark from my boat. The castle was a black shape. Then a light came on in the ruined tower. Not a flash, a steady glow. I watched it for 2 full minutes before it disappeared. I know every boat on this loch. There was no one over there. It gave me a chill I can't explain. Anonymous, Inverness. The entries went back years, a sporadic but persistent thread in the tapestry of tourist impressions. A child who asked her mother about the nice lady in the window with the lamp. A photographer who captured an anomalous, unexplained smudge of light on a long exposure. A smudge that matched the shape of a window arch. Each account was a tiny puzzle piece, forming a picture of something that defied the castle's empty, ruined state. Alistair closed the book, his fingers tingling. The curiosity that had driven him from Inverness was now a focused, burning need. The voices in Glencoe had been a personal violation, the march at Culloden, a historical echo. This was different. This was a visual anomaly, a repeated, witnessed event that suggested not a replay of trauma, but perhaps an imprint of routine. A sentinel from a time when the castle was whole, still performing a nightly round with a lantern, unaware the walls had fallen centuries ago. Or something else entirely. He left the center as it closed, the castle grounds now locked and silent. From the car park he looked back. The ruin was a deeper black against the twilight purple sky and the gunmetal lock. The windows were dark cavities, but as he watched, straining his eyes, he could almost imagine a soft, gold pinprick blooming in one of those high, empty sockets. It was just his mind, fueled by the stories, but the conviction settled in him, cold and clear. He needed to see it for himself. He needed to witness the impossible lights in the ruin, not from a distant shore, but from within the shadow of its broken walls. The chronicle demanded it. The plan, half-formed and fraught with risk, began to solidify in his mind as darkness swallowed the last of the day. The plan was simple in concept, fraught with risk in execution. Alistair waited until full darkness had settled over Loch Ness, a blackness so profound it seemed to swallow the very idea of the distant hills. The tourist car park was empty, the visitor centre a dark, silent block. He had driven a mile up the Lochside Road to a small, overgrown pull-off, hidden from the main thoroughfare by a screen of dense pines. From there, He moved on foot, a shadow among shadows, his pack laden with camera gear, a tripod, and the now ever-present digital recorder. A small, powerful torch was his only light, its beam kept low and used sparingly, a stolen sliver of modernity in the ancient dark. The fence around the castle grounds was a modern wire mesh, but time and weather had loosened it in places. Near the old boathouse, a section sagged inward, offering just enough space to squeeze through, the metal cold and gritty against his hands. He was inside, a trespasser in a kingdom of ghosts. The silence here was different from the open moor of Culloden. It was a contained quiet, held within the broken stone walls, amplified by the vast whispering presence of the loch at his back. He picked his way carefully across the uneven ground, the outlines of foundations and tumbled masonry looming like black teeth in the gloom. His destination was the base of the Grant Tower. He found a spot in the deep lee of a crumbling wall, sheltered from the wind that occasionally sighed off the water, and set up his equipment. The camera was mounted on the tripod, pointed at the tower's skeletal upper floors. He set it for a long exposure, a silent witness that would capture any change in light. The recorder was placed on a flat stone, its red eye glowing faintly. Then he switched off his torch, and the darkness rushed in, absolute and suffocating. At first there was only the sound of his own breathing and the distant liquid lap of water against the shore. The cold seeped up from the ground, a damp, penetrating chill that spoke of centuries of Scottish nights. He wrapped his coat tighter, his eyes fixed on the black holes of the tower windows. They were voids, openings into nothing. He checked his watch, the illuminated dial a tiny, blasphemous clockwork sun in the primordial dark. Minutes stretched, an hour passed. Doubt began to creep in, cold and rational. This was folly. The stories were misidentifications, reflections from boats, the collective imagination of suggestible tourists. He was a fool, shivering in the dark, waiting for a fairy tale. Then, a flicker. It was so faint he thought he'd imagined it, a mere suggestion of luminance in the central window of the second highest floor. He held his breath, his heart a sudden hard drum in his ears. The darkness returned, deeper than before. Had it been a trick of his straining eyes? A distant car headlight refracted through some peculiarity of the atmosphere. It came again. Not a flicker this time, but a steady, warm, golden glow that bloomed within the window arch. It was the light of flame, not electricity. It pulsed and breathed, casting a soft, trembling radiance onto the jagged inner edges of the stone. It was impossible. The room behind that window was open to the sky, a shell. There was no floor, no hearth, no one to hold a lantern. Yet the light burned, unwavering, as if resting on a solid ledge. A wave of cold, unrelated to the night air, washed over him. It was a physical sensation, a drop in temperature that prickled the skin on his face and hands. The air grew heavy, dense with a watchful presence that felt both ancient and intensely focused. He was not alone. Something was in the tower, something that carried its own light and its own cold. As he watched, paralyzed, a second window, to the left of the first, kindled to life. Then, after a pause of perhaps 30 seconds, the light in the first window winked out, and a moment later, a third window, further along the wall, illuminated. The sequence was unmistakable, a progression, a figure with a light, moving through the empty space. He heard, or felt, the soft, gritty scuff of a footfall on stone from high above, a sound that had no right to exist. It was followed by another, a slow, measured tread on non-existent stairs. Step, pause, step. Alistair's hand, trembling, found the cable release for his camera. He pressed the button, holding it for a 30-second exposure. The camera's shutter opened silently, drinking in the scene. He pressed it again, and again. Each click felt like a shout in the sacred quiet. The lights continued their silent, impossible patrol. They would appear, hold for a minute or two, then vanish and reappear elsewhere. The cold intensified, settling into his bones, a chill that felt old, carrying the damp of centuries-old stone and forgotten winters. The footsteps continued, a slow, patient circuit above him. There was no malice in the sound, no urgency. It was routine, a duty performed long after the reason for it had turned to dust, a sentinel, forever checking the walls of a fortress that no longer stood. Then the footsteps stopped. The last light, burning in a window facing the dark expanse of the loch, went out. The tower was a black silhouette once more, but the cold remained, and the sense of presence did not dissipate, it descended. It was no longer above him. It was in the bailey, moving through the ruins between his hiding place and the tower. He could see nothing, but he could feel its passage. A displacement of air, a deepening of shadow within shadow. It was coming closer. Panic, pure and instinctual, seized him. He fumbled for his torch but didn't dare turn it on. He curled smaller against the wall, making himself insignificant. The footsteps resumed, but now they were on the gravel path, slow and deliberate, only yards away. He could hear the faint crunch of stone under a weight that shouldn't be there. The cold became a biting frost, burning his lungs with each shallow breath. The presence paused, as if surveying the area where he hid. Alistair squeezed his eyes shut, a child's defense against the unseen. He felt a gaze upon him, a terrible, empty attention. And then it passed. The footsteps receded, moving toward the loch gate. The cold began to slowly ebb, though a residual shiver stayed locked in his core. For a long time, he didn't move. When he finally dared to look, the ruins were empty, silent but for the loch. The sky to the east was beginning to soften from black to a deep, watery grey. Dawn was approaching. With stiff, frozen fingers, he packed his gear, his movements hurried and clumsy. He did not look back at the tower. He retraced his path to the fence, squeezed through, and stumbled through the pines to his car. Only when the engine was running and the heater beginning to blow stale, warm air did he allow himself to breathe fully. Later, in a cramped hotel room in Drumna Droshit, he reviewed the evidence. The audio recording held only the wind, the water, and his own ragged breathing. But the photographs were undeniable. On the long exposures, the tower's ruins were dark, brooding shapes. And there, in 3 successive frames, were the lights. Soft, orb-like smudges of golden light, perfectly positioned within the window arches. No source, no reflection, no explanation. They were simply there, a visual testament to the impossible. Alistair stared at the images on his laptop screen, the hotel room's electric light feeling garish and false. The haunting at Urquhart was not an echo of violent death, nor a lonely, searching spirit. It was a remnant of habit, of daily life fossilized in the stone memory of the place. A guard, perhaps, or a servant, forever making their rounds, a flickering candle against the endless Highland night, unaware the castle had fallen. He had witnessed it. He had felt its cold gaze. The chronicle now held its first undeniable visual proof. But as he closed the laptop, the triumph was hollow, replaced by a deeper, more unsettling certainty. The past was not just whispering or marching. It was going about its business, locked in an eternal moment, and he had just stepped, shivering, into its light. The air grew thin and sharp, tasting of ice and granite, as the road climbed out of the green straths and into the high, bald realm of the Cairngorms. Alistair left the car at a windswept car park near the Cairngorms ski centre, the last outpost of the horizontal world. Before him stretched a vast, treeless plateau, a rolling desert of heather, rock and peat bog under an immense cloud-scudded sky. His destination was not a castle or a battlefield, but a mountain, Ben Macdui, the second highest peak in Britain. Its summit, a broad, stony dome, was visible only as a distant grey hump against the horizon. This was a landscape that felt primordial, a piece of the Arctic misplaced in Scotland, and its most famous spectre was not a human ghost, but something far more elemental. The fear lieth more, the big grey man. The legend was older than recorded history, woven into the folklore of the Gaels. It spoke of a presence, a towering, shadowy figure encountered in the mist and cloud that so frequently shrouded the high tops. It was not seen clearly, but felt, a crushing sense of dread, an overwhelming feeling of being watched by something vast and ancient, followed by the glimpse of a giant grey shape moving with impossible speed across the boulder fields before vanishing into the fog. Some claimed to hear huge echoing footsteps, Others spoke of a paralyzing fear that drove them blindly down the mountain. For Alistair, after the intimate horrors of Glencoe and Urquhart, this represented a different category of haunting, one that seemed to belong not to human history, but to the mountain itself. The hike in was a lesson in exposure. The path, well trodden but rugged, led across miles of open moorland. The wind was a constant roaring entity, flattening the heather and whipping his coat around him. Sun and shadow raced each other across the barren landscape, and in the distance, banks of cloud clung to the higher corries, shifting and swirling like living things. He felt incredibly small, a solitary insect crawling across the back of a slumbering giant. The sense of being observed was immediate and pervasive, though he chalked it up to the sheer scale of the emptiness. There were no trees, no walls, nowhere for anything to hide, yet the feeling persisted, a prickling on the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the wind. His research had led him to a name, Ewan Matheson, a retired mountaineering instructor who lived in the nearby village of Aviemore and who, according to sparse but credible mentions in climbing journals, had had a definitive encounter on Ben Macdui decades ago. Alistair had arranged to meet him after the hike. The man's voice on the phone had been guarded, but not dismissive. The climb to the summit was a grueling trudge over shattered quartzite and through patches of stubborn, gritty snow. The air grew colder, thinner. As he approached the final broad ridge, the weather began to turn. A wall of cloud, dense and grey as wool, slid down from the northern corries, swallowing the distant peaks one by one. Visibility dropped from miles to yards in a matter of minutes. The world dissolved into a uniform, luminous grey. Sound became distorted. His own breathing and footfalls were muffled, absorbed by the vaporous blanket. This was the domain of the fear lieth. This was where it walked. He reached the summit cairn, a simple pile of stones in a featureless white void. There was no view, only the cloud. The silence, now that the wind was muted by the fog, was profound and eerie. He stood there, completely isolated in a universe of grey, and for a terrifying moment he understood the legend perfectly. In this sensory void, the mind could conjure anything. The primal fear of being lost, of being prey, needed no ghost. The mountain provided the canvas, human terror painted the figure. Shivering, not entirely from the cold, he began his descent, using his compass to navigate the blank whiteness. The encounter with Ewan Matheson, he felt, would either shatter the myth or deepen it beyond measure. Later that afternoon, in the warm wood-panelled clutter of Matheson's sitting room in Aviemore, the high white void felt like a dream. Ewan was a man in his late 70s, lean and wiry, with a network of fine lines around his eyes that spoke of a lifetime of squinting into sun and storm. He moved with an economy that suggested preserved strength. He served strong tea in heavy mugs and regarded Alistair with a steady, appraising gaze. "So you've been up there," Ewan said, not a question. "In the clag, you felt it?" Alistair nodded, describing the oppressive, watchful silence of the cloud. Ewan gave a slow, grim nod of his own. "Aye, that's its house. That's where it waits." He settled into a worn armchair, his eyes losing focus, looking back across decades. "My story isn't special. Many have felt it, but I saw it. Clear as I see you now. And I've never been back to the summit since." He had been a young man, he said, guiding a group of inexperienced climbers on a traverse of the Cairngorm Plateau in the late 60s. The weather had been fair, but on Ben Macdui, fair could turn foul in a heartbeat. A hare, a cold sea fog, had rolled in from the east with shocking speed, enveloping them just as they reached the broad summit plateau. He'd gathered his group, keeping them close, using his compass to lead them off the summit toward the shelter of the Sron Riach Ridge. "That's when the feeling hit," Ewan said, his voice dropping, his hands resting still on his knees. It wasn't just fear of the weather, it was a weight, a sense of something huge standing right behind you. The lads felt it too. One of them started to cry. I told them it was just the fog, the disorientation. I believed it myself. Then we heard the footsteps. They were not the scuff of his own party's boots. They were heavy, deliberate thuds that vibrated through the ground, each stride covering an impossible distance, coming from behind and to the left. He turned, shining his torch, a feeble beam in the dense fog, and saw it. A shadow, Ewan whispered. A shadow darker than the fog, twice the height of a man, and broad. It had no features, no face, no details of clothing. It was just a shape, a cutout of absolute blackness in the grey, and it was moving, not walking, but gliding, fast, parallel to us, about 50 yards off. He described a terror so complete it froze the blood. His group huddled together, whimpering. The figure kept pace with them for what felt like an eternity, a silent, towering escort in the mist. Then, without warning, it changed direction. It turned and began to move directly toward them, accelerating. That's when we ran, Yuan said, a faint tremor in his hands now. Not down the path, blindly, panic. I lost all sense of direction, all my training. We just fled from that advancing darkness. In their blind flight, they stumbled upon a group of experienced climbers who had made camp in a shallow corrie, waiting out the fog. The sudden arrival of Yuan's terrified party startled them. When Yuan, gasping, tried to explain, one of the older climbers just nodded grimly and pointed back the way they'd come. "The fear lieth," was all he said. They shared their tea and waited for the cloud to lift. When it did, the plateau was empty, silent, and bathed in sudden, shocking sunlight. There were no tracks but their own. "It wasn't a ghost," Ewan concluded, fixing Alistair with his pale blue eyes. "Not like the others you're chasing. It's older. It's the mountain's mood, its loneliness given form. Some say it's a yeti, a lost giant. I don't know what it is. I only know it's real. It watches. And when the fog comes down, it walks. It doesn't want to communicate or replay a tragedy. It just is. And its only purpose seems to be to remind you that you are tiny and temporary, and that these hills were here long before you, and will be here long after." Alistair drove back toward his lodgings as dusk stained the cairngorms purple and gold. The interview had left him with a profound disquiet. The Grey Man was not a story about death, it was a story about scale, about the indifference of a landscape so vast and ancient that it could generate its own sentinel of dread. He looked up at the brooding bulk of Ben Macdui, now clear against the evening sky. It looked like what it was, a massive, silent entity, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than any ghostly touch, that somewhere in its stone heart, in the mists that were its breath, the shadow waited. It was not haunted, it was the haunter, and every soul that ventured onto its high, lonely plateau stepped, however briefly, into its field of vision. The wind that swept across the Bay of Scale on mainland Orkney was not the mist-laden breath of the glens or the biting gale of the high mountains. It was a clean, salt-scoured blast, straight from the Atlantic, carrying the tang of seaweed and the endless rhythmic sigh of the sea. It swept over low, green hills and exposed a sight that felt less like a ruin and more like a revelation. Skara Brae was not built upon the land, it was excavated from it, a cluster of low stone-walled dwellings huddled together, half sunk into the ancient midden. That had both protected and entombed them for millennia. The village, older than the pyramids, lay open to the sky, its flagstone floors, central hearths, and stone bed frames looking less like archaeology and more like a neighborhood abandoned only yesterday. But as Alistair walked down the path from the visitor center, the overwhelming feeling was not of recent departure, but of profound, watchful age. This was a place of domesticity, not of battle or baronial strife. The hauntings here, according to his notes, were subtler, stranger. Visitors and staff spoke not of apparitions, but of sensations, of being intently watched from the empty doorways, of hearing low, rhythmic whispers that seemed to emanate from the very stones, voices speaking in cadences that felt like language but in no tongue recognizable to the modern ear. It was as if the daily lives, the conversations, the thoughts of the people who had lived here 5,000 years ago had seeped into the bedrock and, under certain conditions, could still be faintly perceived. Alistair paid his entry and joined a small guided tour, hoping for a knowledgeable perspective. The guide was a woman named Elspeth, whose face was weathered by the constant wind into a map of fine lines, her eyes a pale, sharp grey. She spoke with a quiet passion about the Neolithic villagers, their sophisticated stone furniture, their possible beliefs. She pointed out the narrow, tunnel-like passageways that connected the homes, speaking of community and shared warmth against the relentless Orkney winters. The group listened, snapping photographs of the iconic stone dresser in House 7. As the tour concluded and the others drifted back toward the centre, Alistair lingered. He approached Elspeth, who was checking a information plaque. When he mentioned his interest in the less conventional stories of the site, a subtle shift occurred. The professional, informative demeanor softened into something more cautious, more personal. She looked not at him, but across the sunken village, her gaze lingering on the low doorways that led into darkness. "Aye," she said finally, her voice barely above the wind. "There are stories, not the kind for the leaflets." She agreed to talk, suggesting they walk the perimeter path, away from the last few tourists. They walked slowly, the gritty wind stinging their faces. Elspeth began not with ghost tales, but with the sheer weight of time Skara Brae represented. "You have to understand," she said, "these people lived here for 600 years. Generation upon generation, they were born in those beds, cooked at those hearths, told stories by that firelight. They died there. That's a powerful imprint. Stone holds memory, some say. Not a memory like ours, but a resonance." She then spoke of the phenomena, not as paranormal events, but as reported experiences she had collected over 20 years as a caretaker. She described visitors who, while perfectly alone in one of the house interiors, had suddenly felt an overwhelming, non-threatening presence beside them, as if someone had quietly entered to share the warmth of the hearth. Others, standing in the central open area, had felt a gentle pressure on their shoulder or back, a touch that was gone when they turned. "But the whispers," she said, her voice dropping further, "that's the most common thing, and the most unsettling. Never loud, never clear. It's like trying to hear a conversation through a thick wall. You catch the rhythm, the rise and fall of speech, the occasional sibilant consonant, but the words, they're gone. Or rather, we've forgotten the language." She told him of a linguist who had visited, a professor specializing in dead languages. The woman had sat for hours in House 1, perfectly still, with a high sensitivity recorder. Upon reviewing the tape, she found several minutes of what she described as structured vocalization, definite speech patterns, with pauses and inflections, but utterly incomprehensible. The professor had left pale and shaken, refusing to discuss it further. "It's not just hearing," Elspeth continued, leading him to a vantage point, looking down into the whole settlement. The low afternoon sun cast long, deep shadows from the walls, making the village look like a diagram of itself. It's a feeling of being included in something. "A woman told me she was looking at the stone tank in House 7. We think it might have held fishing bait or water for preparing limpets. And as she looked, she distinctly heard, not in her ears but in her mind, a kind of instructional murmur, a patient, repetitive explanation of a task, accompanied by a clear mental image of hands working with the stones and water. It lasted seconds. She said it felt like a grandmother teaching a child." Alistair felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the wind. This was a different haunting entirely. Not violence, not sorrow, not duty, but the echo of mundane daily life, the ghost of domestic routine. Elspeth saved the most potent story for last. She spoke of a renowned archaeologist, a pragmatic man utterly skeptical of anything beyond trowels and carbon dating. He had been leading a small private dig in the midden layer just south of the village, searching for organic remains. It was a still, overcast day, the sea a flat grey sheet. He was on his knees, brushing soil from a fragment of bone, Elspeth said, her eyes distant. And he said the world just changed, not visually, auditorily. The sound of the sea faded away, the wind stopped, and he was surrounded by a babble of voices, chatting, laughing, a child crying, the clatter of stone on stone. He said it was vividly three-dimensional. He could tell which sounds came from which house. He could smell peat smoke and something earthy, like stewed shellfish. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Then the modern sounds rushed back in. He said he looked at his hands, covered in Neolithic dirt, and felt for the first time in his career, not like a scientist uncovering the past, but like an intruder who had just blundered into a lively, crowded room that had instantly fallen silent at his arrival. She fell quiet, letting the wind reclaim its voice. He never spoke of it publicly, but he told me, over a whiskey, that it changed everything for him. He said Skara Brae isn't haunted by ghosts, it's haunted by life. The stones remember the living village, not its death. And on rare days when the veil is thin, they play that memory back. Alistair thanked her, his mind reeling. He spent the next hour alone, wandering the prescribed walkways, peering into the dim interiors. He sat on a bench facing the village, switching on his recorder. He closed his eyes, trying to silence his own thoughts, to listen past the wind and the distant gulls. At first there was nothing. Then, as a particularly strong gust died away, he heard it, or felt it, a low, rhythmic murmur, like many people speaking softly at once. It had no source. It seemed to rise from the ground itself, from the very flagstones under his feet. It was the sound of a community, a hive of quiet activity. He opened his eyes, half expecting to see figures moving in the houses. They were empty, the shadows unmoving. But the whispering continued, a susurrus just at the threshold of hearing. It was not threatening. It felt ancient, busy, and utterly indifferent to him. It was the sound of 1,000 forgotten conversations, of gossip, of lullabies, of plans made for the next day's fishing, all compressed into a single, endless exhalation from the past. He felt a profound sense of being an outsider, not just to a place, but to an entire continuum of time. He left Skara Brae as the last of the sun gilded the edges of the clouds. The experience left him with a deep, resonant melancholy. Glencoe held a lost soul, Culloden a traumatic death, Urquhart a lingering duty. But Skara Brae held the ghost of breakfast, of mending tools by the fire, of a mother singing. It was the haunting of normality, of 5,000 years of simple human days, and that, in its own way, was more profoundly moving and eerie than any spectre of violence. The ancient stones did not whisper of their end. They whispered of their lives, and the sheer accumulated weight of those lives was a presence more tangible than any shadow. The wind carried his car away from the bay, but the murmurs seemed to follow, a soft ancient chorus in the back of his mind, speaking of a world that was, and was forever gone. The road to Dunatar did not so much end as fray into a narrow, winding track that clung to the cliff edge with a kind of desperate faith. Alistair parked in a small gravel lot perched high above the North Sea, the wind here a constant roaring force that snatched at his coat and filled his ears with the sound of its own fury. Before him, across a deep green chasm and connected by a steep, sloping path, the castle rose. It was not a ruin in the sense of Urquhart, a broken thing on a lost shore. Dunatar was a fortress of sheer defiant drama, a cluster of stone towers and walls crowning a massive isolated sea stack, lashed on all sides by the crashing, white-frothed waves hundreds of feet below. It looked less like a building and more like a natural outcrop that had grown a crown of battlements, a place where history felt secondary to the raw, elemental struggle between rock and sea. He paid his fee to a stoic attendant in a tiny booth and began the descent into the grassy saddle that led to the castle gate. The path was exposed, the wind threatening to pluck him from the cliffside. The air tasted of salt and cold stone. As he drew nearer, the scale of the place became overwhelming. The walls, stained dark by centuries of salt spray, rose sheer from the cliff edges, their surfaces pitted and scarred by time and weather. This was a place of last stands, of sieges, of the infamous hiding of the Scottish crown jewels from Cromwell's troops. Its history was one of impregnability and desperate defense. But Alistair had not come for the military chronicles. His notes spoke of a more elusive phenomenon, shadow figures. Unlike the defined apparitions of Culloden or the purposeful light-bearer of Urquhart, the phantoms of Dunatar were described as fleeting. dark silhouettes seen moving along the precarious cliff paths outside the walls, or standing sentinel on the battlements against the stormy sky. They were not detailed. They were human-shaped absences of light, often spotted from the mainland path or from the castle itself, only to vanish when approached. Locals whispered they were the spirits of guards who had fallen from the vertiginous cliffs, or perhaps of prisoners who had attempted escape over the deadly rocks, forever pacing the edges of their doom. Crossing the wooden bridge over a now dry defensive ditch, Alistair passed through the massive, arched gatehouse and into the heart of the fortress. The wind was partially muted inside the enclosing walls, but the sound of the sea was a constant, booming bass note from below. He explored the roofless halls, the chapel with its empty windows framing seascapes of breathtaking violence, the stark remains of the keep. The views were spectacular and terrifying, straight down to where the ocean shattered itself against black rocks in explosions of white spray. It was easy to imagine a misstep, a slip on wet stone, a long, silent fall. The sense of exposure was absolute, a constant reminder of the thin margin between solid ground and oblivion. He spent the morning methodically walking the perimeter, the wind tearing at his notes. He saw no shadows, only the dramatic play of sunlight and cloud racing across the sea and the cliffs. The other visitors, bundled against the cold, seemed similarly focused on the views and the history plaques, their voices snatched away by the gale. He was beginning to feel the familiar creep of rational doubt. When, near the cliff-edge foundations of the prison vaults, he noticed a man. The man was not looking at the view. He was perched on a low, broken wall, a high-end camera with a long lens mounted on a tripod before him. He was focused intently on a section of the northern cliff face, a sheer drop beyond the castle walls where a narrow, crumbling footpath was visible, clinging to the rock. He was perhaps in his 40s, dressed in practical, weatherproof clothing, his face wind-burned and serious. There was a concentration to his posture that went beyond that of a landscape photographer. Alistair approached cautiously. "Dramatic light today," Alistair said, raising his voice over the wind. The man glanced up, his eyes sharp and assessing. He gave a curt nod. "Aye, and it changes every second, makes for challenging work." Alistair introduced himself and his project. The man's guarded expression softened slightly into one of weary recognition. He introduced himself as Callum, a professional photographer from Aberdeen who specialized in historic sites and wild landscapes. He'd been coming to Dunatar for years, he said, in all seasons and weathers. "You're after the shadows," Callum stated, not a question. He looked back through his viewfinder. "Most are. They think it's a ghost story. For me, it started as a technical anomaly. Now, I'm not so sure." Intrigued, Alistair asked him to explain. Callum sighed, a sound lost in the wind. He gestured for Alistair to look at the camera's digital display screen. On it was a stunning image of the castle's northern flank, taken earlier that morning in the low, raking light. The stonework was etched in sharp relief, the sea a turbulent blue-grey. Callum zoomed in on a section of the cliff path, barely a goat track, that ran outside the castle wall. "See there?" Callum pointed to a faint vertical smudge of darker grey against the rock face. "Now watch." He scrolled to the next image in the sequence, taken perhaps 30 seconds later. The smudge was gone. He scrolled back. There it was again. It was indistinct, but undeniably tall and narrow, suggestive of a figure standing motionless on the path. "I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow from a passing cloud," Callum said, his voice low. "But the cloud cover was consistent. I checked the metadata, the shutter speed. Nothing accounted for it. It was just there, and then not." He scrolled further through the morning's shoot. He showed Alistair another sequence, this time of the high battlements on the seaward side. In one frame, the parapet was empty. In the next, a long, thin shadow lay across it, as if cast by a person standing at the edge. In the third, it was gone. There was no sun in a position to cast such a shadow from any structure nearby. "I've captured dozens of these over the years," Callum admitted, a note of frustration in his voice. "Never when I'm looking directly. Only on the review screen. They're never clear, just silhouettes, implied shapes, sometimes on the cliffs, sometimes on the walls, sometimes just outside the gatehouse, like a sentry pacing. He looked at Alistair, his professional detachment cracking to reveal a deep unease. "I've shown them to colleagues. They talk about lens flare, sensor dust, atmospheric distortion. I know my gear. I know this place. These aren't technical faults." He described being alone on the cliffs at dusk once, packing up his equipment. From the corner of his eye, he saw a dark shape detach itself from the shadow of the gatehouse and move with a slow, drifting gait along the path he had just vacated. He spun, camera raised, but the viewfinder showed nothing. The feeling he described was not of fear, but of a profound melancholy loneliness, a sense of being in the presence of a vigilance that had long since lost its purpose. "They're not interacting," Callum mused, gazing out at the tumultuous sea. "They're not replaying a battle or a fall. They're just present, like stains on the air. Restless spirits maybe, but restless in a quiet, perpetual way, guarding a fortress that's become a monument, watching a sea that never changes. It's as if the sheer intensity of this place, the isolation, the constant assault of the elements, the weight of its standoffish history, left impressions. Not full memories, just shadows of the people who once filled these spaces, their forms worn thin by time and wind, until only a dark outline remains." Alistair stared at the images on the screen, the unexplained silhouettes that defied Callum's technical expertise. They were the most compelling evidence he'd encountered yet, not a personal testimony of terror, but a captured anomaly, a visual ghost offered up by technology itself. He spent the rest of the afternoon with a new focus, his own camera in hand, not just documenting the castle but scanning the cliffs and walls, searching for those fleeting absences of light. He saw nothing with his own eyes, but as the sun began its descent, casting the castle into a stark, dramatic silhouette against a fiery sky, he felt the change. The tourist crowds had dwindled to a handful. The booming of the sea seemed to grow louder, more insistent. The wind took on a colder edge, carrying with it the deep chill of the ocean depths. Standing on the high battlements, looking down at the murderous rocks below, Alistair understood. Dunatar's hauntings were not about individual stories. They were about the totality of the place, its defiance, its isolation, its role as a sentinel against the endless sea. The shadows were the residue of that collective purpose, the echo of every watchful eye that had ever scanned the horizon from these walls, every soldier who had paced these stones. They were not lost souls but lost functions, their human forms eroded away until only the outline of their duty remained, pacing the cliff edges in a silent, eternal vigil. As he made the long, windy climb back to the car park in the gathering dusk, he turned for a last look. The castle was a black cutout against the dying embers of the sky, and for a moment he thought he saw a deeper patch of darkness shift along the highest parapet, moving against the wind before it was swallowed by the night. It might have been a trick of the fading light, but after seeing Callum's photographs, he knew better. Dunatar's ghosts were shadows, cast by no living thing, reminders that on these cliffs the past hadn't faded, it had simply dissolved into silhouette, forever watching the relentless grey sea. The vast, treeless expanse of the Cairngorms Plateau had a way of dissolving certainty. Under the immense cloud-ribbed sky, distances deceived, landmarks shifted in the hazy light, and the very ground seemed to breathe with a slow, ancient rhythm. Alistair had returned to the high mountains, not to conquer a peak like Ben Macdui, but to lose himself in a subtler, more insidious mystery. His destination was a specific network of trails in the heart of the national park, where the legends were not of a single grey man, but of the very earth's betrayal. Here, hikers told of paths that simply ceased to exist, of well-marked trails that faded into trackless heather, leading the experienced and the novice alike into a disorienting maze from which some took hours, or terrifyingly, days to escape. He parked at a remote trailhead near the languid flow of the River Dee, the last outpost of the familiar. The air was crisp and carried the sweet, peaty scent of the moor. His map was detailed, his compass secure in his pocket, his GPS unit fully charged. He was prepared, yet a low hum of anxiety persisted, a legacy of his previous encounters. This haunting was different. It did not threaten with presence, but with absence. It did not show itself, it hid the way home. The path began clearly enough, a ribbon of worn earth leading away from the car park, winding through low, rolling hills of heather still holding the purple memory of summer. The sun was bright. The sky, a vast pale blue bowl. For the first hour, the hike was a pleasure, a rhythmic meditation of boot on path, the only sounds the sigh of the wind and the distant cry of a curlew. He passed a few other walkers, exchanges of nods and brief smiles, all following the same obvious trail. He felt a flicker of doubt. How could a path vanish in such conditions? His research, gathered from online hiking forums and a sobering talk with a mountain rescue volunteer in Braemar, suggested it was never about the weather. It happened on clear days as often as in mist. The stories were eerily consistent. A hiker, confident on a known route, would round a bend or crest arise to find the path ahead, less defined. The trodden earth would become patchy, then would be replaced by undisturbed heather and moss. They would backtrack, only to find the path behind them now seemed unfamiliar, branching in ways they didn't recall. Panic would set in, the compass would seem to spin, and the landscape, once friendly, would become a uniform, featureless prison. Some spoke of a sudden, profound silence, a draining of color from the surroundings, as if the very life of the place had been siphoned away, leaving behind a sterile, confusing replica. Alistair pressed on, the trail now descending into a shallow, nameless glen where a burn chattered over brown stones. He crossed it on stepping stones, noting the path continuing clearly up the opposite slope. He stopped for water, consulting his map. He was exactly where he should be. The reassurance was short-lived. As he climbed out of the glen, the character of the land changed subtly. The heather grew taller, more uniform. The views, once expansive, were hemmed in by the gentle, rolling contours of the land. The path was still there, but it felt softer, as if less traveled. He passed a lone, wind-sculpted rowan tree, its berries a shock of red. He noted it on his map as a waypoint. 100 yards further, he glanced back. The tree was still visible, a sentinel in the empty landscape. Good. Then he rounded a broad, heather-clad shoulder of hill, and the world seemed to reset. The clear path simply ended. It didn't peter out. It stopped as if sliced off with a knife. Before him stretched an unbroken sweep of heather, rising to a low summit cairn he hadn't noticed on the map. Confused, he turned. The path behind him was still there, leading back the way he came. He retraced his steps to the rowan tree, its red berries suddenly seeming garish, almost mocking. From the tree, the path forward looked exactly as it had before, clear, inviting. He walked it again, step for step, and again, at the exact same spot, the earth beneath his boots changed from packed dirt to springy virgin heather. The path was gone. It was like watching a film reel skip a frame. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. He checked his GPS. The screen flickered, the signal icon dropping to 1 bar, then blinking out entirely. A common enough occurrence in the hills, but the timing felt malicious. He pulled out his compass. The needle spun lazily, then settled, pointing not to the expected north, but steadfastly toward the anomalous summit cairn. He shifted his position. The needle remained locked on the cairn, as if magnetized. A deep, visceral disorientation swept over him. The reliable constants of the world, direction, trajectory, the solidity of a trail, were bending. The silence he had read about descended. The wind died completely. The distant burn could no longer be heard. The only sound was the frantic thud of his own heart. The colors of the landscape seemed to bleach out, the heather losing its purple tinge, the sky fading to a watery white. The familiar cairngorms had been replaced by a silent, drained model of itself. He was in a place that looked right but felt profoundly wrong. He fought the rising tide of panic. He had a map, a brain. He could triangulate his position using the cairn and the rowan tree. But when he looked back for the tree, it was no longer where it should have been. It had moved, or the land had shifted around it. It now stood at a different angle, further away. Nothing made sense. The rational part of his mind screamed about topographical confusion, about a rare but documented neurological effect of high open spaces. But the animal part of him knew he was in the grip of the phenomenon. The path hadn't just disappeared, the logic of the landscape had unraveled. He stood still, forcing himself to breathe slowly. The stories said running made it worse. The land fed on panic. He closed his eyes, blocking out the deceptive visuals. He focused on the physical sensations, the cool air on his face, the rough texture of his jacket sleeve under his fingers, the solid, real pressure of the ground under his boots. He thought not of maps, but of the car, the smell of its interior, the feel of the steering wheel, the weight of his keys in his pocket. A tether to reality. When he opened his eyes, nothing had changed visually, but he made a decision. He would ignore the compass, ignore the missing path, ignore the relocated tree. He would walk not by sight, but by the memory in his muscles, retracing the exact footsteps he had taken from the burn crossing. He turned his back on the summit cairn and began to walk, counting his paces, focusing on the sensation of each footfall. For 50 paces there was only featureless heather. Then his boot scuffed on something hard. He looked down. A stone, slightly darker than the others, worn smooth. A trail marker, subtle but definite. Another 10 paces and another. He was on a path again, but it was not the one he had come in on. This one was older, fainter, winding through the heather in a different direction. He followed it, not because it was his original route, but because it was a route, a thread out of the labyrinth. The silence broke. The wind returned with a gentle sigh. Color seeped back into the world, the deep green of moss, the rich brown of peat, the vast blue of the sky. The disorienting pressure in his head lifted. After another 20 minutes of walking, the faint path joined a wider, well-trodden track he recognized from his map. His GPS unit beeped softly, its screen full of confident green signals. He was back in the world. He sat on a rock, his legs trembling not from exertion but from released tension. The experience had lasted less than an hour, but it felt like a journey through a different dimension. There had been no ghost, no shadow, no whispering voice. There had only been the land itself, turning alien, withdrawing its hospitality. It was a haunting of geography, a spirit of misdirection that lived in the contours and the light. The disappearing path wasn't a trick. It was a temporary rewriting of the rules, a reminder that in these ancient hills, the way forward was never guaranteed, and the ground beneath your feet could choose at any moment to forget you were there. He looked back the way he had come. The plateau lay peaceful, beautiful, bathed in afternoon sun. It gave no hint of its secret, of its capacity to gently, quietly erase the way home. The most terrifying hauntings, Alistair realized, were not those that pursued you, but those that simply let you become lost. The rain that had chased Alistair down from the Cairngorms finally caught him on the road to Fort William, a relentless grey downpour that turned the lochs to hammered lade and the mountains into smudges of charcoal behind a watery veil. Exhaustion was a physical weight, a compound of miles hiked, nights spent shivering in the dark, and a psyche increasingly frayed by encounters with the intangible. The disorientation of the disappearing path still clung to him, a subtle vertigo that made the solid tarmac under his tires feel provisional. He needed a roof, a locked door, a bed that didn't smell of damp earth. He needed, however briefly, to believe in walls. Fort William, when it emerged from the gloom, was a functional town, a pragmatic cluster of stone and neon clinging to the shore of Loch Lynne. It felt modern, transient, a place for stocking up on supplies before heading back into the wild. But Alistair's destination, gleaned from an obscure travel forum dedicated to atmospheric accommodations, was a relic that predated the town's mountaineering shops and bustling cafes. The Glenlochy Inn stood on a quiet side street, a 3-story building of dark, weathered stone with narrow, mullioned windows that seemed to peer suspiciously from under a steep slate roof slick with rain. Ivy, thick and gnarled as old rope, clutched at its western face. It did not invite, it endured. Pushing open the heavy oak door was like stepping through a membrane into another century. The air inside was warm, still, and carried a complex bouquet of wood smoke, beeswax polish, and something beneath, a faint, dry scent of old paper and forgotten lavender. The reception was a small, wood-paneled nook, lit by a single brass lamp with a green glass shade. A grandfather clock ticked with a slow, sonorous heartbeat in the corner. There was no one at the desk, only a little brass bell. Its ring seemed absurdly loud in the hushed space. The man who appeared from a back room seemed carved from the same timber as the paneling. He was elderly, with a thatch of white hair, and a face lined not with smiles but with a kind of patient observation. His name, he said, was Mr. Macaulay, and he had been the innkeeper for 40 years. His movements were precise, economical, as he checked Alistair in, his eyes briefly flicking over the camera bag and recording equipment with an expression that was neither curious nor disapproving, merely noting. "Room 7, Macaulay said, handing over an old-fashioned heavy key attached to a worn leather fob. "Top of the stairs, turn left. It's quiet." There was a weight to the word quiet that suggested it meant more than the absence of noise. The room was, exactly as promised, quiet, clean, and steeped in the past. A four-poster bed with heavy damask curtains dominated the space. A faded Turkish rug covered wide floorboards that creaked with a specific lonely note underfoot. A small fireplace, cold and swept clean, was framed by dark marble. The window looked out onto the rain-slicked street and the weeping bulk of the mountains beyond. It was a comfortable room, thoughtfully appointed, but it held a stillness that felt accumulated, layered like the varnish on the old furniture. After the vast, threatening outdoors, this enclosed silence was a different kind of pressure. Dinner in the low-ceilinged dining room was a solitary affair of hearty stew and dense bread. Only 2 other tables were occupied, by couples speaking in hushed tones. The air of sepia-toned tranquility was pervasive. Yet, as Alistair sat with his notebook after the plates were cleared, sipping a dram of whiskey, he felt the familiar, itchy curiosity return. An inn this old, in a land so thick with memory, could not be without its stories. And Mr. Macaulay, with his watchful eyes, seemed a keeper of them. He found the innkeeper later, tending to the fire in a small book-lined snug just off the main lobby. Macaulay looked up as Alistair hovered in the doorway, his expression unchanging. When Alistair mentioned he was documenting local histories and folklore, a subtle shift occurred. It was not eagerness, but a kind of resigned duty, as if he had been waiting for this inquiry. "Aye," Macaulay said, poking a peat brick until it glowed. "This house has its share, not loud hauntings, nothing to frighten the horses, more like lingering guests who forgot to settle their bill." He gestured for Alistair to take the worn leather armchair opposite. The firelight danced on the spines of old books and deepened the shadows in the corners of the room. Macaulay settled into his own chair, steepling his fingers, his gaze on the flames. "It's mostly room 7, he began, his voice a soft, dry rasp. "And the corridor outside. You're in 7 tonight. Don't look alarmed. She's harmless, just persistent." The she, Macaulay explained, was believed to be a woman from the Victorian era. No one knew her name or story. She was simply a figure, seen by perhaps a dozen guests over the decades, always in the same attire, a high-necked dress of dark, somber grey or black, with a faint pattern only visible in certain lights. Her hair was styled in a severe bun. She was never seen full face. She was always in profile, or from behind, or glimpsed in the dim reflection of a window. "She doesn't walk the corridor," Macaulay said, his eyes distant. "She passes through it, through the walls themselves." Guests report seeing her emerge from the wallpaper beside the old linen cupboard, glide silently across the passageway, her feet never seeming to touch the floorboards, and disappear into the solid wall opposite, near the window at the end. The first time, they think it's a trick of the light, a shadow from a car passing outside, but then she turns her head, just slightly, enough to see the pale curve of her cheek, the severe line of her hairstyle, and then she's gone, melted into the plaster as if it were mist. He recounted the story of a honeymooning couple in the 1970s. The young wife had awoken in room 7 to see the woman standing at the foot of the 4-poster, looking out the window at a moonlit night. She assumed it was a maid, though the hour was late. She spoke, asking if she needed anything. The figure turned, offered a faint, sorrowful smile that didn't reach her eyes, then took 2 steps sideways and vanished through the solid wall. The wife's screams brought the whole floor running. The husband saw nothing but his wife's ashen face. Then there's the cold lady. Macaulay continued, as if cataloguing inventory. "Not a visual spectre, but a sensation. In room 4, directly below yours. Guests complain of a specific, localized cold. Spot that drifts. It might be by the wardrobe one moment, then at the bedside the next. It's described as a lady-shaped chill. A few have felt a gentle pressure on the edge of the bed in the dead of night, as if someone has sat down briefly, followed by a wave of profound melancholic sadness that has no source in the sleeper's own mind. It passes in minutes, leaving only the cold." He spoke of other, smaller phenomena, the sound of a child's ball bouncing slowly down the main staircase when no child was present, the faint, sweet scent of pipe tobacco that sometimes filled the first-floor landing, attributed to a long-dead previous owner who had died of a heart attack in his study, the occasional soft, rhythmic scratching from within the walls of room 7, like a quill on paper, heard only in the deepest quiet of the night. "I don't promote it," Macaulay said firmly, finally looking at Alistair. "This is a respectable house, but I don't deny it either. These things are part of the fabric, like the knots in the wood. The woman in grey, I've never seen her myself, but I've felt her, a change in the air when you're alone upstairs, a sudden stillness that's too deep. She's not malevolent, she's just present, going about her business in a house that may have been hers once, following routes that made sense when the walls were in different places. A renovation in 1890, you see. We found old plans. The corridor you're on now was once 2 smaller rooms. Where she walks through the wall, that was a doorway." The explanation was delivered with such mundane certainty that it was more chilling than any tale of horror. This was not a violent death or a tragic loss replaying. It was the ghost of domestic architecture, a soul adhering to a forgotten floor plan, her daily rounds fossilized into eternity. Alistair returned to room 7, the heavy key turning with a solid clunk in the lock. The room was as he left it, yet utterly changed. Every shadow in the damask bed curtains seemed a potential grey dress. The wall opposite the bed, plain and painted a soft cream, now held the possibility of containing a silent, sorrowful woman. He set up his recorder, more out of habit than hope, and prepared for bed. The night was profound. The rain had stopped, leaving a silence so complete he could hear the blood singing in his own ears. He lay in the dark, the old house settling around him with groans and sighs that were the language of timber and stone. He was on the edge of sleep when he heard it. A soft, dry whisper, not of voice, but of movement. A subtle swish, like heavy fabric brushing against wallpaper, from the corridor outside his door. He held his breath. The sound did not come again, but a moment later, a deep, penetrating cold seeped under the door and pooled in the room, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. It carried with it the faint, ghostly scent of lavender and old dust. The air pressure seemed to drop, his ears popping softly. He stared at the door, then at the wall to its left, the wall that, according to Macaulay's old plans, had once been an opening. Nothing emerged. No grey lady walked through the solid plaster. But the presence was undeniable, a patient, quiet occupancy just beyond the threshold of perception. The inn was not just a shelter from the haunted outdoors. It was a vessel, holding its own collection of echoes, gentle but inescapable. Alistair pulled the covers higher, the weight of the old damask both a comfort and a shroud. In Fort William, even the walls were not silent. They remembered their old doors and the guests who had once, and forever, passed through them. The crossing to Skye was a passage into myth. The bridge that spanned the Narrows was a modern, pragmatic thing, but as Alistair drove onto the island, the landscape itself felt like a storybook opening. The Quilin Mountains rose in the south, their jagged black peaks wreathed in cloud like the spines of sleeping dragons. To the north, the land unfolded in a softer, stranger palette, rolling hills of emerald and russet, dotted with locans that held the sky like shattered mirrors. And everywhere, great fingers of naked rock thrusting from the earth, the ancient bones of the world laid bare. Here, the hauntings were not of history's grief, but of the Sith, the fairy folk. The veil between worlds was said to be thin, and the places where it frayed were not battlefields or castles, but natural formations, certain pools, specific mounds, and most famously, the the fairy bridges. Alistair drove north along winding single-track roads, past crofts with grazing sheep and whitewashed houses clinging stubbornly to the hillsides. His destination was a stretch of coastline near the village of Struan, where two natural sea arches spanned a rocky inlet. They were not built by human hands, but sculpted by millennia of Atlantic fury, stone bridges carved by water and time. According to law, they were not merely geological curiosities, they were thresholds, used by the Sith to pass between their hidden realm and our own. To cross them after dusk, or to disturb the offerings left there, was to invite misfortune or a more intimate eerie attention. He parked in a small gravel lay-by and followed a well-trodden path down toward the roar of the sea. The air was thick with salt spray and the damp, peaty scent of the island. The path wound through bracken and over spongy turf before opening onto a dramatic vista. Below, the sea churned in a narrow channel, exploding in white geysers against black seaweed-slicked rocks, and spanning the chasm were the two arches. The larger one was a massive curved span of dark basalt, sturdy and imposing. The smaller, further out, was more delicate, a graceful stone bow that seemed too perfect to be natural. They were breathtaking, monuments to elemental force, and they hummed with a presence that felt older than any human ghost. Alistair spent the afternoon observing, taking photographs, and noting the small, curious deposits at the landward foot of the larger bridge. Tied to a hardy clump of grass were strips of colored cloth, rags really, faded by sun and salt. Coins had been pushed into crevices in the rock. A few smooth white stones were arranged in a careful pattern. These were Cluti offerings, a tradition older than Christianity. A piece of cloth from an ill person tied here was believed to transfer the sickness to the fairies, who might carry it away. The coins and stones were pleas or thanks for favors. The practice was kept alive, not necessarily out of belief, but out of a deep-seated cultural respect, a reluctance to offend the ancient tenants of the land. As the sun began its slow descent, staining the western clouds with apricot and rose, the few other visitors departed, leaving Alistair alone with the booming sea and the gathering shadows. He'd arranged to meet a local man, Donny, who farmed a croft inland, and who, according to the proprietor of his Portree B&B, had the site and a story about the bridges. Donny had agreed to meet at dusk by the car park. The light was leaching from the sky when a battered Land Rover rattled into the lay-by. Donny was a man in his late 60s, with a face the texture of old leather and eyes of a startling, clear blue that seemed to see more than just surfaces. He moved with the deliberate, economical grace of a man used to rough ground. He nodded a greeting, his expression neutral, and led Alistair to a flat rock overlooking the chasm, now filling with deep purple shadow. "You're not the first to come asking," Donny said, his voice a soft burr that blended with the sea's rumble. "Most want the pretty stories. The dancing lights, the music. It's not always pretty." He lit a pipe, the scent of rough tobacco cutting the salt air. He was silent for a long moment, watching the water foam under the arches. "I was a boy. My grandfather warned me never to be here past sunset. But boys are fools. I'd been out checking traps, lost track of time. It was just like this, the last light in the sky, the first stars pricking through. I was on the path there," he pointed to the cliff above the smaller arch, "when I saw them." He took a long draw on his pipe, the ember glowing in the twilight. They weren't the little people of picture books. They were tall, slender, almost like reflections in moving water. You could see the shape of them, but they weren't solid, translucent-like. A pale, shimmering light came from within them, a cool glow like moonlight on frost. There were 3, maybe 4. They were gathered on the far side of the smaller bridge, the one that looks too frail to hold a cat. Donny described them as having an unearthly stillness, yet they seemed to be conversing, their heads inclined toward one another. He heard no sound over the sea, but he felt a vibration in the air, a high, almost musical hum that resonated in his teeth. Then, one by one, they began to cross the slender stone arch. They did not walk, they glided, their forms flowing like mist over the rock, their faint light tracing a path across the span. "I was hidden in the bracken, frozen," Donny whispered, Not with fear at first, with awe. It was beautiful, terribly beautiful. Then the last one stopped in the middle of the bridge. It turned. It looked right at me. He fell silent, the memory tightening the lines around his eyes. It had no face you could describe, just a suggestion of features in the light. But I felt its gaze. It wasn't angry. It was assessing, like I was a curious stone or a stray animal that had wandered into a private garden. Then it raised a hand, just a pale shimmer, and made a gesture, a slow, sweeping motion toward the land behind me, as if shooing me away. The moment the gesture was complete, a wave of profound, disorienting drowsiness had washed over Donnie. His limbs grew heavy, his thoughts sluggish. The urge to lie down in the bracken and sleep was overwhelming. With a last burst of boyish panic, he had torn his gaze away, scrambled to his feet, and run, stumbling and half-blind with unnatural fatigue, all the way back to his grandfather's croft. He collapsed at the door and slept for 14 hours straight, a sleep filled with strange, geometric dreams of moving light and stone. When he awoke, he had a fever that lasted 3 days. He never went near the bridges at dusk again. "My grandfather knew as soon as he saw me," Donnie said, tamping out his pipe. He didn't scold, he just nodded and said, "So, you've been seen." He told me the bridges aren't just doors they use, they're markers. The land around them is a garden, a borderland. We're allowed to visit in the daylight, to leave our little gifts. But when the light fails, it's their time. To be seen by them is to be noticed, and to be noticed is to risk being invited in or swept aside. They don't think like us. Their kindness and their cruelty are two sides of the same coin. He stood up, his joints cracking. The stories you'll hear from others, the music, the laughter, the lights leading travelers astray on the moors, they're all true in their way. But it's not a haunting of dead humans. It's a sharing of space with something that was never human, that lives alongside us, just out of sight. The bridges are the stitches holding the two worlds together. Pull at the thread, and you might unravel something. Donnie left with a final warning glance at the now fully dark arches, which were only visible as deeper black cuts against the starry sky. Alistair remained, the recorder in his pocket having captured every word. The story had shifted something in his understanding. The fear here was not of what had died, but of what had never lived as he understood life. He waited as full night settled, the Milky Way a dusty river overhead. He saw no translucent figures, felt no drowsy enchantment. But the atmosphere was charged with a potent, watchful energy. The roaring sea seemed to form a wall of sound behind which anything could be happening. The cold that rose from the chasm carried a sharp, mineral scent that felt ancient and alien. Looking at the ragged cloth offerings fluttering in the night breeze, Alistair understood. This was not superstition, it was a treaty, a delicate agreement with the native spirits of place. The fairy lore was not mere myth, it was a framework for explaining the uncanny sensations, the sudden disorientations, the eerie beauty of this landscape that defied simple ownership. The ghosts of Skye were not echoes of the past, they were its eternal, otherworldly tenants. As he walked back to his car, the dark shapes of the bridges behind him felt less like stone and more like silent sentinels guarding a threshold. He was profoundly relieved he had not, this night, been invited to cross. The island's magic was not gentle, it was old, and it had rules written in a language of light and gesture that humans had long forgotten how to read. The road south from Fort William unwound like a frayed ribbon into a landscape that seemed to reject the very concept of boundary. Rannoch Moor was not a place one visited, it was a place one traversed, a vast treeless quagmire of peat bog, heather, and dark, still lochans that stretched to a horizon broken only by the distant, saw-toothed peaks of the Black Mount. The sky here was immense, a dome of shifting cloud and sudden dramatic light that painted the desolation in strokes of gold and bruised purple. It was a land of water and sky, with only a thin, uncertain crust of earth in between, a place where the ground itself felt like a rumour. For Alistair, still carrying the claustrophobic stillness of the inn's corridors and the eerie treaty of the fairy bridges, the moor's absolute exposure was both a relief and a new kind of unease. Here, there were no walls to harbour ghosts, no ancient stones to whisper. Here, the haunting was atmospheric, elemental, and it danced on the surface of the bog itself. He had read about the will-o'-the-wisps. The folklore was universal, pale, flickering lights seen over marshes at night, leading the weary and the lost deeper into treacherous ground until they vanished into the mire. In Scotland, they were called Fair Chlis, or the Merry Dancers, a deceptively cheerful name for a phenomenon tied to doom. Scientific explanations pointed to marsh gas, ignited pockets of methane, but the stories persisted, woven with a chilling consistency. Travelers, particularly on the old military road that skirted the moor's edge, told of seeing clusters of these lights behaving with an unsettling intelligence, beckoning, retreating, mimicking lanterns of a phantom caravan. Alistair's plan was to drive the moor road at night, to see if the modern tarmac could hold back the ancient lure of the lights. He spent the afternoon at a lonely pub on the moor's fringe, a low building of stone hunched against the wind. By the peat fire, he pored over a musty local history borrowed from the publican. The accounts were brief, stark, and fatalistic. A shepherd in the 1920s, searching for lost sheep in a fog, was found days later, drowned in a shallow peat pool, his face frozen in an expression of tranquil confusion, pointed toward the center of the moor. A pair of hikers in the 1950s, their car broken down, reported following a friendly, bobbing light they believed was a rescuer on foot, only to be led a mile off the road into a sucking bog. They survived by sheer luck, clinging to a hummock until dawn. The lights were never described as threatening. They were described as hopeful, helpful, certain, the most dangerous kind of deception. As twilight bled across the vast expanse, turning the pools to sheets of burnished lead, Alistair felt a profound isolation settle upon him. The few farmsteads vanished behind, and the road became the only human artifact in a primeval world. He drove slowly, his headlights carving a feeble tunnel through the deepening gloom. The moor absorbed the light, giving nothing back. To either side, the land was a black void, the occasional gleam of water the only indication of depth. The wind, a constant companion on the high places, was eerily absent here, replaced by a thick, damp silence broken only by the hum of his engine. It was a silence that felt like a held breath. He turned off the car's interior lights, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness beyond the windscreen. The sky was partially clouded, allowing only occasional glimpses of starlight. The road ahead was a strip of faint grey, disappearing into nothingness. He had driven for 20 minutes, the isolation becoming a tangible pressure, when he saw the first light. It was off to the left of the road, perhaps 100 yards out into the bog. A soft blue-white glow, about the size of a lantern flame. It hovered just above the heather, motionless. His pulse quickened. Car headlight reflection, a distant house. But there were no houses, no other cars. As he watched, the light began to move, not drifting aimlessly, but gliding parallel to the road, keeping pace with his car. It moved with a smooth, almost playful motion. Then a second light appeared, further out, a fainter greenish orb. Then a third, closer to the road, this one a warm yellow flicker. They were different colors, different intensities, but their movements were coordinated. They danced around each other, weaving intricate patterns in the air, dipping toward the black ground and soaring up again. They were beautiful, mesmerizing, a silent ballet in the void. The rational part of his mind screamed swamp gas, bioluminescence, atmospheric refraction, but the older, instinctual part whispered the old name, Firclis, the Merry Dancers. A strange, almost gravitational pull began to emanate from them. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. The lights seemed to be coalescing ahead of him, gathering just beyond the reach of his headlights, as if forming a luminous guide. They pulsed invitingly. For a dizzying second, the thought flashed through his mind. What if they are guides? What if they're showing a safe path? The stories of lost travelers echoed in his head, the shepherd's tranquil face, the hiker's desperate hope. The deception was not in menace, but in offering exactly what the lonely mind most desired in that moment: direction, companionship, light in the overwhelming dark. He forced himself to focus on the grey strip of tarmac, to ignore the seductive dance at the periphery of his vision. But the lights grew bolder. One of them, the blue-white one, darted suddenly across the road just 30 feet ahead, streaking from left to right. His foot jerked toward the brake, but he stopped himself, heart hammering. It was a trick, a lure to make him stop, to make him get out and follow. Then they were all around him, not just to the sides, but ahead, weaving across the road itself. His headlights would catch one, and it would vanish, only to reappear behind him in the rearview mirror. They cast no illumination on the ground. They were pure, sourceless light. The inside of the car filled with a faint, multicolored glow reflected from their dance. The silence was now profound, the hum of the engine seeming to mute, as if the moor was swallowing sound along with light. Panic, cold and sharp, finally broke the trance. He accelerated, the car surging forward. The lights kept pace, streaking alongside like malevolent fireflies. One danced directly in his path, and he swerved instinctively, the tires skidding on the damp asphalt with a sickening whine. He wrestled the steering wheel, fighting the urge to overcorrect, feeling the vast, hungry blackness of the bog just beyond the narrow verge. For a terrifying second, the car fishtailed, its headlights sweeping across a nightmare panorama of shimmering lights and bottomless dark. Then the tires gripped, and he shot forward, pressing the accelerator to the floor. The lights pursued him for another half-mile, a swirling, silent retinue of doom. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they winked out. All of them. The darkness rushed back in, absolute and crushing. His headlights now showed only the empty road, the painted lines a sudden, blessed testament to reality. He drove for another 10 minutes, his knuckles white, his breath coming in ragged gasps, before he dared to slow down. Pulling over at a rare gravelly widening in the road, he turned off the engine. The silence was total. He stared out into the moor, now just an undifferentiated mass of black. There were no lights, there was no sound. There was only the vast wet dark and the frantic beating of his own heart. He had not been led off the road. He had not crashed. But the intent had been there. He felt it in the intelligent, coordinated dance, in the way they had sought to control his path, to draw his eye from the safe, solid tarmac to the treacherous, glowing unknown. He started the car again and drove, slowly now, toward the distant promise of lights from the village of Bridge of Orchy. The experience on the moor had been different from all the others. It held no history, no tragedy, no lingering human emotion. The will-o'-the-wisps were not echoes. They were phenomena, but phenomena with a predatory cunning. They were the spirit of the land's indifference given form, not hostile, but utterly uncaring, playing a fatal game with any living thing that dared to cross their domain in the vulnerable night. Rannoch Moor was not haunted by memory. It was haunted by the ancient, mindless lure of the bog itself, a siren song of light that promised guidance and delivered only a cold, silent grave in the peat. As the first real lights of human habitation appeared in the distance, Alistair felt no comfort, only a deep, unshakable chill. The most terrifying phantoms were not those that remembered, but those that simply were, and whose only purpose was to make the lost forever belong to the dark. The rock upon which Stirling Castle stood was not merely a hill, it was a fulcrum of Scottish history, a great volcanic fist thrust up from the flat karst lands to command the vital ford over the River Forth. As Alistair drove across the flat, fertile plain, the castle appeared suddenly, crowning its sheer-sided crag with a silhouette of towers and walls that spoke of power, not ruin. Unlike the shattered keeps of Urquhart or Dunatar, Stirling was pristine, meticulously restored, a living museum of royal ambition. Its stone was golden in the afternoon sun, its flag snapping crisply in the breeze. It felt solid, authoritative, a monument to order and continuity. Yet, as Alistair joined the stream of tourists flowing through the gatehouse, he knew that even here, in this bastion of preserved history, the past was not content to remain behind glass. The hauntings here were not of common soldiers or lost servants, but of royalty itself, echoes of crowned heads whose personal tragedies had seeped into the very mortar of the state apartments. The air within the walls was different from the wild, windy spaces of the Highlands. It was still, almost hushed, thick with the scent of polished oak, beeswax and old stone. Tour guides in period dress spoke in clear, projected voices about James IV and Mary of Guise, about the Renaissance Palace and the Great Hall. The crowds moved in respectful clusters, admiring tapestries and replica thrones. It was all so impeccably presented, so managed, that the idea of a ghost seemed almost impertinent. But Alistair's notes, gleaned from the accounts of former staff and overnight security guards, pointed to a persistent, sorrowful presence in one of the most opulent rooms, the chamber where Mary, Queen of Scots, had spent her infancy and to which she had returned as a teenage widow, a queen in a gilded cage. He moved with the tour through the royal palace, its exterior festooned with enigmatic stone figures, the sterling heads. The rooms were lavish, filled with light from enormous windows overlooking the kingdom she had briefly ruled. The guide, a woman named Catriona with a melodious voice and a wealth of historical detail, explained the politics, the marriages, the betrayals. She spoke of Mary's flight to England, her long imprisonment, and her eventual execution at Fotheringhay. It was a tragic story, but it was delivered as history, its pain softened by centuries. As the group dispersed, Alistair lingered near a deeply recessed window in the Queen's inner hall. Catriona, gathering her notes, noticed his hesitation when he approached and quietly mentioned his interest in the castle's less documented residents. Her professional smile softened into an expression of weary recognition. She glanced around at the emptying room. "The day shift doesn't see them," she said, her voice dropping below its guiding pitch. "It's too busy, too full of the living. But stay after the last bell. The atmosphere changes." She agreed to speak more after her final tour, suggesting they meet in a quieter courtyard. An hour later, with the castle closed to the public and the slanting evening sun painting the stone walls a deep honey gold, Alistair found Catriona sitting on a bench in the Queen's Knot garden. The geometric parterre laid out far below the castle walls. The bustling crowds were gone, replaced by a profound, watchful stillness. The wind carried the distant sounds of the town, but up here, a sepulchral quiet reigned. "It's always the crying," Catriona began without preamble, her eyes on the distant Oakhill Hills. "That's the first thing the overnight staff report and the few historians who've been granted permission to work late in the archives. Not loud sobs, a soft, hopeless weeping. It seems to come from the Queen's bedchamber, but when you go in, the room is empty and the sound is coming from the next room or the corridor. It moves. It's a sound that seems to drift on the still air, searching." She described encounters that were brief, chilling, and imbued with a specific regal sorrow. A cleaner, locking up the palace floor at dusk, had seen the reflection of a woman in a dark, elaborate gown in a window pane. The reflection was turned away, shoulders shaking silently. When the cleaner turned, no one was there. A security guard on a night patrol had felt an intense, localized cold spot in the bedchamber, so sharp it made his breath plume. As he stood in it, he had heard a whisper, not in his ear, but in his mind, a single despairing French word, "Pourquoi?" Why? But the most common sighting, Catriona said, turning to face him, her face grave, is in the long gallery, especially on wet, windy nights. A woman in a gown of deep mourning black, her face pale and strained, pacing. Not walking, but pacing with a frantic, trapped energy. She's seen from a distance, through doorways or at the far end of the gallery. She never looks at the observer. She seems entirely absorbed in her own anguish. And then she'll stop, often by a particular window that looks north toward the Highlands, and she'll simply fade, as if the stone walls have absorbed her grief back into themselves. Catriona believed, as did many who worked there, that this was not the ghost of Mary's violent death in England, but of her life here. The phantom was trapped in the years of her early widowhood after Lord Darnley's murder, when she was surrounded by intrigue and betrayal, a Catholic queen in an increasingly Protestant and hostile land. The crying was the sound of a young woman stripped of power and freedom, weeping for a lost husband, a lost kingdom, a lost future. The pacing was the restless energy of a prisoner in a luxurious jail. The apparition was not replaying a moment of death, but a prolonged state of living despair. "The castle is full of history's winners," Catriona mused, standing up and brushing off her skirt. James VI looking triumphant in his portraits, but Mary, she's the shadow, The great what if. Her tragedy is woven into this place's success. The stone remembers her tears as well as it remembers his coronation. On quiet nights, when the modern world recedes, her sorrow is what rises to the surface. It's not a malicious haunting, it's a melancholic one. A queen forever weeping in the home she could never truly keep. As darkness began to pool in the courtyards, Catriona departed, leaving Alistair with a special after-hours pass granted for research, courtesy of a sympathetic curator who had read his proposal. The castle was now his alone, save for the distant, occasional footfall of a security guard. The transformation was immediate and profound. The echoing halls, so full of narrative purpose by day, now felt cavernous and empty. His own footsteps on the flagstones were shockingly loud. He made his way to the Queen's bedchamber. The room was beautiful, the bed hung with rich fabrics, but in the dim security lighting, it felt like a stage set after the play has ended. He stood in the center, switching on his recorder, and waited. At first, there was only the faint hum of electricity and the distant, rhythmic tick of a clock from some other room. Then, a subtle shift in the air pressure, a cooling. From somewhere nearby, perhaps the adjacent dressing room, came a sound. It was the faintest exhalation of breath, hitched and soft, a sigh that trembled on the edge of a sob. He froze, his skin prickling. The sound did not repeat, but the cold intensified, wrapping around him like a damp shroud. It carried a scent, faint floral, like dried rose petals and old incense, undercut by the acrid tinge of salt tears. He moved into the long gallery, a vast, narrow space lined with portraits of stern-faced kings. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, painting silver rectangles on the floor. He walked slowly to the far end, near the north-facing window Catriona had mentioned. The view was a black void, the lights of Stirling twinkling below. He turned, looking back down the length of the gallery. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom near the far doorway. It resolved into the shape of a woman, tall and slender, clad in a dress so dark it was indistinguishable from the shadows, only visible as a disruption in the pattern of moonlight on the floor. She was pacing, a quick, agitated movement, her head bowed, one hand pressed to her brow. He could hear no footfall, only the whisper of heavy fabric over stone. She reached the midpoint of the gallery, stopped abruptly, and turned toward the window. Her face was a pale oval, featureless at this distance, but the attitude of her body was one of utter dejection, shoulders slumped as if under an unbearable weight. Alistair stood transfixed, not by fear, but by a wave of empathetic sorrow so potent it tightened his throat. This was not a scary ghost, it was a profoundly sad one. The figure raised her hands, pressing them against the cold glass, as if trying to push through to the free air beyond. She stood like that for a long moment, a statue of despair. Then, slowly, she began to dissolve, not vanishing, but fading, becoming transparent, the moonlight and the shadows behind her beginning to show through the fabric of her dress, the outline of her form, until there was nothing left but a lingering chill and the imagined scent of roses and tears. The gallery was empty again. The recorded audio, he would later find, held only the sound of his own breathing and the faint creak of the ancient building. But the image was seared into his mind. He had come to Stirling expecting perhaps a grand, tragic apparition, a queen in her moment of execution. Instead, he had witnessed the ghost of a life half-lived, of potential crushed under the weight of politics and fate. The castle's royal phantom was not a spectre of death, but of imprisonment, a reminder that even the highest stations could be cages, and that the echoes of a broken heart could resonate through stone long after the crown had been passed on. Leaving the silent palace, the cheerful lights of the town below seemed a world away. He carried with him a new kind of haunting, the quiet, desperate sound of royal tears falling forever in a well-kept, empty room. The road to Glenfinnan wound through a landscape of soft green hills and still, dark lochs, a gentler prelude to the drama that lay ahead. Yet, as Alistair rounded a final bend, the view that opened before him was one of breathtaking, industrial grandeur imposed upon pristine wilderness. The Glenfinnan Viaduct was not a ruin or a fortress, but a monument to Victorian ambition, a graceful 21-arched curve of pale concrete soaring 100 feet above the floor of a wooded glen, carrying a single railway line into the mountains. It was a site of pilgrimage for fans of a certain boy wizard, but Alistair had not come for cinematic nostalgia. His notes spoke of a different kind of magic, one that operated on the ears rather than the eyes. Here, in the shadow of the great arches, people reported hearing the unmistakable sounds of a steam train, the distant, mournful shriek of a whistle, the rhythmic chuff-chuff-chuff of a laboring engine, the metallic clank and rumble of wheels on rails. The phenomenon was consistent, chilling, and had one impossible condition. There was never a train on the viaduct when the sounds occurred. He parked in the visitor centre lot, the viaduct dominating the skyline, its elegant spans mirrored in the still waters of Loch Shiel below. The day was overcast, the air heavy with the promise of rain, muting the colours of the autumn bracken and turning the loch the colour of polished slate. A handful of tourists pointed cameras upward, hoping to catch the scheduled steam service, the Jacobite, as it crossed. Alistair shouldered his pack, which now felt incomplete without its digital recorder, and made his way down the path toward the base of the great piers. The scale was humbling. Up close, the viaduct was a colossus, each arch a cathedral-like space of shadow and echoing sound. The wind, funneled through the glen, made a low harmonic moan as it passed through the spans, a natural music that only added to the atmosphere. He found a spot on a mossy hummock, well away from the other visitors, with a clear view of the entire curve. He took out his recorder, checked the levels, and set it on a flat stone. Then he waited. Not for a train, but for the absence of one. His research had been a collection of frustrated testimonies. Hikers, campers, and even railway enthusiasts swore they had heard the distinctive sounds of a steam locomotive approaching from the east, building to a crescendo as it reached the viaduct, only to see the arches stubbornly, undeniably empty. The sounds would then fade westward as if the phantom train continued its journey toward Mallaig. There were no stories of visual apparitions, no ghostly engine or spectral carriages, only the sound, perfectly mimicked, hauntingly out of sync with reality. After an hour of noting only the wind and the occasional chatter of tourists, the scheduled Jacobite steam train finally appeared. It was a magnificent sight, a plume of white smoke against the grey sky, the cheerful toot of its whistle echoing around the hills. The train chuffed slowly across the viaduct, a living piece of history, its passengers waving from the windows. The sounds were vivid, rich and full of mechanical life. Alistair recorded it all, a baseline of the real to compare with the unreal. Once the train had passed and its sounds had faded into the distance, a deeper silence returned, now freighted with expectation. As the afternoon wore on and the tourists began to drift back to their cars, Alistair remained. A fine, misting rain began to fall, softening the edges of the world and damping all sound. He was alone now, the viaduct a great, grey ghost of itself in the drizzle. He checked his watch. The next real train, a modern diesel service, wasn't due for hours. This was the time, according to the accounts, when the phantom made itself known. He sat perfectly still, his senses straining. The rain pattered softly on his waterproof jacket. The loch lapped gently at the shore. Then, a new sound threaded its way through the natural ones. Faint, very distant, but unmistakable. The deep, throaty whistle of a steam engine. It was not the cheerful toot of the Jacobite. It was older, lonelier, a drawn-out cry that seemed to come from the far end of the loch, where the tracks emerged from a tunnel. His pulse quickened. He glanced at the viaduct. Empty. The sound grew slowly, resolving into the rhythmic, exhausting chuff-chuff-chuff of a heavy train climbing a gradient. He could hear the distinct syncopated beat of driving wheels on rails, the hiss of steam, the clatter of couplings. It was all there, a perfect auditory illusion growing louder and louder, as if an invisible train was approaching the eastern end of the viaduct at speed. He stared at the point where the tracks met the first arch. Nothing moved but the rain. The sounds reached a peak, a roaring, chuffing cacophony that seemed to be right on top of him, directly overhead. He looked up, his neck craned, half expecting to see steam and iron blotting out the sky. There was only the damp curve of the arch, with a single dislodged raindrop falling from its edge. The phantom train was now on the viaduct, its sounds echoing with shocking clarity between the stone piers, the grind of steel on steel, the hollow rumble through the girders, a sharper metallic clank that might have been a loose fitting. It was so vivid, so spatially precise, that his mind refused to accept the evidence of his eyes. The viaduct remained obstinately, terrifyingly vacant. Then, as the sounds began to fade toward the western end, the whistle blew again. This time, it was different, a short, sharp, almost desperate blast, followed by a drawn-out wail that diminished into the mist-shrouded hills, and then silence. Not the gentle silence of before, but a dead, hollow quiet, as if the landscape itself was stunned. Alistair's hands were trembling. He stopped the recorder, his fingers cold and clumsy. He played back the last few minutes. Through the hiss of the rain, it was all there, the approaching chuff, the roar on the viaduct, the retreating whistle. The recording was clean, undeniable. He had captured the phantom sounds. A week later, in a cluttered university office in Edinburgh smelling of old books and coffee, he played the recording for a friend of a friend, an acoustic engineer named Dr. Anya Sharma, who specialized in audio anomalies. She listened intently, her brow furrowed, through high-end headphones. She played it again and again. Finally, she removed the headphones, her expression one of profound puzzlement. "The waveform is consistent with the acoustic profile of a heavy steam locomotive," she said, her tone clinical but edged with unease. "The frequencies, the reverberation patterns offer stone structure. It's textbook. But the spatial cues are wrong." She explained that in a real recording, the sound would move from one microphone channel to another, reflecting the train's passage. In Alistair's recording, the sound was eerily omnipresent, filling the stereo field equally, as if the source was everywhere and nowhere at once. There were also subtle harmonics, faint overlays of sound that shouldn't exist, a faint, almost human sigh beneath the hiss of steam, a metallic ringing like a distant bell that had no place in a train's mechanics. "I could try to explain it as an auditory mirage," she said, leaning back in her chair. "A perfect storm of wind through the arches, water dripping, distant traffic noises, all filtered through a listener's expectation. Pareidolia of the ears. But this," she tapped the screen, "displaying the sound wave, this is too structured, too sequential. It has a narrative. It starts, it climaxes, it ends. Nature doesn't compose symphonies with this clarity, and your recorder picked it up, which rules out a purely psychological event." She had no explanation. The phantom sounds of Glenfinnan, captured on a digital file, defied both folklore and physics. They were not a ghost story, they were an acoustic ghost, a sonic memory trapped in the glen, perhaps from a long-lost train or a tragic incident never recorded, playing itself back on a loop for anyone quiet enough to listen. As Alistair left the office, the puzzle was no closer to being solved, but the evidence was now irrefutable. The Highlands held more than visual specters. They held echoes, perfect and impossible recordings of events that had left no physical trace, sound without source, haunting the air itself with the memory of passage. The road west wound through a landscape that softened from mountain sternness to a gentler, rain-lush green, where the scent of salt began to overpower the peat. Oban announced itself not with grandeur, but with a practical maritime bustle, a horseshoe bay crowded with ferries, fishing boats and pleasure craft, backed by a tidy town climbing the hillside. The air was thick with the cries of gulls and the tang of seaweed, diesel and fresh fish. It was a town of comings and goings, a gateway to the Isles, its lifeblood the sea. But Alistair had not come for the living port. He sought the dead one, the haunted harbours where sailors, on nights of howling gale or dead calm, swore they had seen ships that had no right to sail. He parked near the North Pier, where the Calmac ferries loomed like great white cliffs. The day was overcast, the sky a uniform pearl grey, the waters of the Firth of Lorne a restless leaden chop. The normalcy was almost jarring after the lonely moors and silent castles. Here was life, noise, commerce. Yet, as he walked along the esplanade, past shops selling waterproofs and shortbread, His eyes were drawn to the older, stone-built corners of the harbour, the places where the Victorian fishing fleet had once berthed, where the shadows lay deeper and the water slapped with a colder, more knowing sound against the slimy steps. His research pointed to a specific retired captain, a man named Hector MacLean, who lived in a cottage overlooking the bay and who was known in certain pubs as the man who had seen the Sith ship. The story was a local legend, a ghostly galleon, its sails full of a wind that did not stir the surrounding air, seen gliding into the bay on the wildest of nights, only to vanish before it reached the pier. Hector, it was said, had witnessed it not from land, but from the wheelhouse of his own trawler 50 years ago, and had never taken a night watch since. Alistair found the cottage, a whitewashed house with blue shutters, its small garden a riot of hardy flowers battling the salt spray. The man who answered the door was in his 80s, stooped but with shoulders that still suggested a lifetime of bracing against the weather. His eyes were the pale, washed-out blue of a winter sea, and they held a depth of seeing that went beyond mere sight. Once settled in a cramped parlour smelling of tobacco, boiled cabbage and polish with a view of the grey bay through lace curtains, Hector listened to Alistair's request without surprise. He poured 2 small glasses of a dark, potent whiskey, handed one over, and took a slow sip, his gaze fixed on the window. "Aye," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble like stones in a tide. "The Sporran Dub. That's what my grandfather called it. The Black Purse, a ship of ill omen." He took another sip, the memory drawing his features tight. It was the winter of '73. A filthy night. A gale coming down from the north, screaming through the Sound of Mull like a banshee. I was skipper of the Morning Star, a sturdy boat, but we were late back, caught out by the weather. We were making for the bay, fighting every wave, the lights of Oban like a handful of tossed jewels in the blackness ahead. He described the struggle, the wheel fighting in his hands, the green water crashing over the bow, the crew tense and silent at their posts. They were a mile out, the beam of the lighthouse on Carrera slicing through the rain and spume, when his lookout, a young lad from Tyree, gave a shout and pointed starboard. "I thought it was a trick of the storm," Hector murmured, his eyes losing focus. "A shadow in the rain." But it grew solid. A ship, a tall ship, 3-masted, with square sails set full and straining. But it was wrong. The sails were a pale, luminous grey, like rotten canvas lit from within by moonlight. There was no light on its decks, no running lamps, and it was moving, silently. In that gale, you should hear the shriek in the rigging, the crash of the bow. This ship made no sound at all. It cut through the waves like a knife through smoke, leaving no wake. The Phantom Galleon was on a direct course, not for the safe channel, but for the treacherous skerries south of the bay. Hector, his own heart a frantic drum, had grabbed the VHF radio, shouting a warning, thinking it was some fool of a yachtsman in dire trouble. There was no response, only static. He swung his powerful spotlight onto it. The beam should have illuminated wood, rope, men. Instead, it seemed to pass through the vessel, illuminating the driving rain and sea spray behind it. The ship was semi-transparent, a detailed phantom, its timbers dark with age, its rigging a complex web of shadow. He could see the outline of figures on deck, motionless, like statues. "It came within 200 yards, Hector whispered, his hand tightening around his glass. Close enough to see the carvings on the prow, a woman, her hair streaming, her face a mask of sorrow. And then, the wind. Our wind, the real gale, was still tearing at us. But around that ship, the sea began to calm. The waves flattened. The rain seemed to part around its masts. It was sailing in its own pocket of dead, cold air. The Sporran Dub held its course for the rocks for another minute, a silent, glowing spectre of doom. Then, just as it seemed it must surely strike, it began to fade, not by turning or sailing away, but by dissolving. From the stern forward, its luminous sails melting into the storm, its hull becoming insubstantial mist, until there was nothing left but the howling gale and the wild, dark sea where it had been. "We made port," Hector said, finishing his whiskey in one gulp. "The lad from Tyree quit the sea the next day. never set foot on a boat again. I reported it to the Coast Guard. They logged it as a stress-induced hallucination, storm fatigue. Maybe it was. But I've talked to others, old men now, who've seen similar things in these waters. A Viking longship off Lismore in the fog, a ghostly drifter off the Garvelux. The sea has a longer memory than the land. It doesn't give up its dead easy. And sometimes, when the conditions are right, it shows you what it's keeping. He fell silent, the story hanging in the room with the peat smoke from a dying fire. Alistair thanked him, the words feeling inadequate. He left the cottage as the first lamps were being lit along the esplanade, the bay now a black pool dotted with the cheerful mundane lights of modern vessels. He walked down to the old harbour, away from the ferry terminals, to where the fishing boats rocked in their berths. Their nets hung like giant grey cobwebs. The night was clear now, cold, the stars sharp pinpricks in the velvet sky. The water lapped gently against the stone quay. He stood there, listening to the creak of ropes and the gentle knock of hulls, and he let Hector's story settle. The ghost ship was not a personal tragedy like the Weeping Queen or the Lost Climber. It was a piece of maritime legend made manifest, a collective phantom born from centuries of stories of ships. Lost with all hands, of vessels that sailed into myth, it was the sea's own haunting, a reminder that these busy, safe waters were built upon a foundation of countless silences, of voyages that never ended at any port. The Sporran Dub was a warning from the deep, not to any individual but to all who sailed, a glimpse of the final silent passage that waits beyond the storm. As a ferry sounded its deep horn, heading out into the dark channel, the cheerful noise felt suddenly frail against the vast, remembering quiet of the sea. Oban's ghosts were not in its houses, but in its horizon, in the black water that held the echoes of every ship that had ever failed to come home. The rain that began as Alistair drove east from Oban was not the gentle, misting drizzle of the glens or the salt-lashed squalls of the coast. It was a hard, relentless downpour that fell from a sky the colour of tarnished pewter, a sky that seemed to press down upon the hills, squeezing the light from the day. The windshield wipers beat a frantic, metronomic rhythm, but they could not keep pace with the water streaming down the glass, blurring the world into a smear of grey-green and charcoal. He was driving without a clear destination, the road a slick black ribbon leading him deeper into the heart of the country, away from the sea's mournful legends, and back into the embrace of the mountains. And as he drove, a storm of a different kind began to gather within him. It was a slow, cumulative pressure, a weight that had been building since the first whisper in Glencoe. Each encounter, each documented phenomenon, had been a stone added to a cairn on his soul. He had sought them out, these echoes of the past, with the detached curiosity of a chronicler. But the detachment had been chipped away, piece by piece, by the cold touch of the impossible. The stones of his professional curiosity had been worn smooth by a grinding, intimate fear. Now, as the landscape blurred past, the individual hauntings ceased to be isolated stories and began to weave themselves into a single terrifying tapestry. The pattern was undeniable, and it was the pattern that truly chilled him. It was not random spookiness, not arbitrary bumps in the night. Each phenomenon was a knot tied in a specific moment of human suffering. The lost climber in Glencoe, forever calling in the mist born of his final, confused moments. The slaughtered Jacobites on Culloden Moor, their collective terror bleeding into the peat. The drowned sailor of Loch Ness, eternally warning others from the fog that had claimed him. The Victorian woman pacing the forgotten floor plan of her home, the Queen weeping in her gilded prison. The phantom train, perhaps echoing a long-forgotten wreck on the viaduct. Even the will-o'-the-wisps and the fairy bridges spoke to older, more elemental fears of being lost or taken, tragedies of a different kind. Every ghost was a story that had ended in despair, in violence, in loneliness, or in sudden, terrible silence. The Highlands were not merely scenic, they were a vast open-air mausoleum, and every valley, every loch, every crumbling wall was a headstone for a tragedy. He was not touring haunted sites. He was walking through a graveyard of unresolved emotions, where the headstones were made of mist and memory, and the epitaphs were whispered on the wind. The loneliness of these places struck him with a new, profound force. It was not just the physical isolation, the empty moors, the remote bothies, the ruins standing sentinel over empty glens. It was the metaphysical loneliness of the spirits themselves. The grey man was the loneliness of the mountain, ancient and indifferent. The shadows of Dunatar were the loneliness of duty without end. The whispers of Skara Brae were the loneliness of a whole world forgotten. And the human ghosts, they were the ultimate loneliness, consciousness trapped in a moment of pain, severed from time, from community, from peace. They were echoes, screaming into a void, and he had been making himself an audience. His growing fear was no longer a simple jump-in-the-night dread of the unseen. It had matured into a deep existential terror. It was the fear that the barrier between the past and the present was not a wall, but a frayed curtain, and he had been brushing against it, gathering its threads. It was the fear that by listening so intently, by opening himself to these stories, he had made himself perceptible. They knew his name in Glencoe. They had passed by his hiding place at Urquhart. They had watched him from the cliffs and the mist. He was no longer an observer, he had become a participant, a faint blip on the radar of the dead. The car felt like a fragile shell, a tin can rushing through a landscape that now felt actively hostile. The mountains looming in the rain were not beautiful, they were watchful. The glens were not picturesque, they were hungry. The very air seemed thick with the residue of old sorrows, a psychic humidity that made it hard to breathe. He thought of the warm, noisy pub in Oban, the simple, living bustle of it, and it felt like a memory from another lifetime, a dream of safety. He pulled over at a deserted viewpoint, the car shuddering as he parked. The engine died, and the sound of the rain on the roof became a deafening roar. He sat there, hands clenched on the steering wheel, staring out at a world reduced to shades of grey. The loch below was a sheet of hammered lead. The mountains were ghosts of themselves, shrouded in cloud. He was exhausted. It was a fatigue that went beyond physical tiredness. It was a soul weariness, a saturation point for the uncanny. His notebook, once a symbol of exciting inquiry, now felt like a ledger of dread, each entry a door he had opened that could not be fully closed. The evidence on his recorder and camera was no longer a triumph. It was a burden, proof that he had not imagined the creeping horror. A profound sense of isolation settled over him, colder than the rain. He had chosen this path alone, and now he was alone with its consequences. Who could he tell about the feeling of a queen's despair seeping into his bones? Who would understand the intelligent malice of the dancing lights on the moor? The academic in Edinburgh had been puzzled by the audio, but she hadn't felt the phantom train's passage, the way the sound had vibrated in his teeth. This journey had carved a hollow space inside him that normal conversation could not fill. The storm outside mirrored the one within. The wind picked up, howling around the car, rocking it on its springs. Lightning flickered silently behind the clouds, followed by a growl of thunder that seemed to come from the very bowels of the hills. It felt like a response, an acknowledgement of his turmoil. The gathering storm was not just meteorological, it was the culmination of all the gathered sorrow, the concentrated energy of every tragic echo he had pursued. And he was sitting in the middle of it, a lightning rod for memories that were not his own. He knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and clarifying, that he could not continue like this. He could not simply move to the next haunted site on his list, a tourist of terror. The journey had reached a crisis point. The chronicle demanded a conclusion, but his spirit demanded survival. To turn back now, however, would be to live forever with the whispers, to let the fear win. There was a finality needed, a confrontation. Not with a specific ghost, but with the heart of the haunting itself. He needed to understand the depth of the horror, to look into the eye of the storm, not to conquer it, but to know its true shape. Only then could he hope to escape its pull. Starting the engine, the sound was a small, defiant noise against the elemental fury. He pulled back onto the road, the headlights cutting two feeble cones into the pouring dark. He was no longer driving aimlessly. A resolve, cold and hard as the granite of the mountains, was forming within him. The pattern was clear. The hauntings were tied to tragic death, to loneliness, to places where life had been violently or sadly interrupted. If he wanted the final word for his chronicle, the definitive encounter, he would have to go to a place that concentrated that pattern into its purest, most potent form. He would seek out a story so saturated with loss, so remote and forgotten, that its echo would be undeniable. He would find a place where the storm had already happened, and where it still raged forever in silence. The gathering storm within him had found its direction. He was driving now, with a purpose that felt like a sentence, toward a final encounter with the darkness he had spent weeks documenting. The chronicler was preparing to write his last chapter, not from research, but from the very heart of the haunt. The map was a confession of emptiness. In the weak grey light of a roadside cafe, its laminate surface sticky with condensation, Alistair traced a single thin line of road that frayed into a dotted track, which then dissolved entirely into the pale, featureless expanse representing the interior of the Monadliath Mountains. His finger came to rest on a tiny, unnamed dot, a cartographer's afterthought, annotated in his own cramped handwriting: Loch Nan Dearc, the Lake of the Cave, more specifically, the bothy at its shore. The story, pieced together from fragments in old newspaper archives and the reluctant murmurs of a librarian in Inverness, was a cold, bare skeleton. 5 years prior, a group of 4 university friends from Edinburgh had embarked on a late autumn hiking trip into the Monadliaths. They were experienced, well-equipped. Their plan was to spend 2 nights at the remote Loch Nan Dearc bothy, a simple stone shelter maintained by the Mountain Bothies Association. They never returned. A concerned parent raised the alarm. A massive search, hampered by early snows, found the bothy a week later. The 4 young people were inside. There was no sign of violence, no struggle, no obvious cause of death. The post-mortems concluded exposure, a clinical term that masked a multitude of horrors. Their supplies were untouched. Their sleeping bags were unrolled, as if they had simply lain down and stopped. The official report spoke of carbon monoxide poisoning from a blocked chimney, but the chimney had been clear. It suggested a shared sudden illness, but no pathogen was ever identified. The case was closed, a tragic mystery. The locals, however, had another word for it. They called it the Bothan nan Taibse, the bothy of the apparition. They said the lonely loch had taken them, that something in that high, silent place had simply called their spirits out. It was perfect. It was the culmination of every pattern, remote, tragic, unexplained, and wrapped in a silence that bred terrible stories. The gathering storm within Alistair now had a focal point. This would be his final investigation, the last entry in the chronicle. He would go to the bothy, spend the night, and document whatever atmosphere clung to the stones. He needed to know if the horror was in the place, or in the mind, or in some terrible space between. The warnings came subtly, but they came. At a petrol station in the last proper village, the attendant, an old man with knuckles swollen like burls, eyed his supplies: a heavier sleeping bag, extra fuel canisters, a week's worth of dehydrated food. "Heading up into the hills?" the man asked, his voice neutral. "Towards Loch Nan Dearc," Alistair replied, forcing a casual tone. The man's hands stilled on the pump. He didn't look up. "That's a lonely spot. Early for the snow, but not for the mist. It gets into the bones up there." He finally met Alistair's eyes, his gaze flat and knowing. Some places are best left to themselves. They've had enough visitors. Later, at a pub where he stopped for a hot meal, the barman, upon hearing his general direction, simply shook his head and said, "The bothy by the dark loch. You'll not find company there, only memories. And they're poor company on a cold night." No more details were offered, just a palpable wall of unease. It was not the playful superstition of the fairy bridges or the respectful fear of the sea ghosts. This was a deep, visceral aversion, a community's instinct to look away from a wound in the landscape. The final miles of road were a narrowing tunnel through stands of skeletal pine. Then the tarmac ended. A rough, rutted track, barely worthy of the name, led upwards. He parked where it became impassable, the car seeming absurdly bright and fragile against the dun-colored moor. The silence here was immediate and total. No wind, no birds, just the vast waiting quiet of the high plateau. He shouldered his pack, heavier now with the weight of his purpose, and began to walk. The path was a faint indentation in the peat and heather, often disappearing entirely, forcing him to navigate by compass across a landscape of rolling, identical hummocks. The sky was a low, uniform grey, pressing down like a lid. After 2 hours of trudging, he crested a rise, and there it was. Loch Nan Dearg lay in a shallow, stone-rimmed bowl, its water black and utterly still, not a ripple marring its obsidian surface. It reflected the grey sky perfectly, creating a disorienting inversion of world and reflection. On its near shore, huddled against a backdrop of scree and bare rock, was the bothy. It was a low, rectangular block of rough grey stone, its roof sagging slightly, a single dark doorway and a single small window like blank, sightless eyes. It looked less like a shelter and more like a tomb that had surfaced from the peat. The name, he realized, was likely wrong. Dearg could mean cave, but also pupil or dark center. The lake of the dark center. It felt apt. The approach was the quietest walk of his life. His boots on the stony ground were the only sound, each crunch. A blasphemy. The loch absorbed all noise, all life. He saw no insects, no birds on the water. The air was cold, but it was a dry, dead cold, devoid of the energizing bite of mountain air. It was the cold of a space long denied sunlight. He pushed open the bothy's heavy wooden door. It swung inward with a groan of rusted hinges. The interior was one room, about 12 feet by 15. The floor was packed earth. A crude stone fireplace took up one wall, its chimney a black hole leading upwards. 2 rough wooden sleeping platforms, like shelves, were built into the opposite wall. The air was frigid and carried a complex scent, cold ashes, damp stone, mouse droppings, and beneath it all, a faint, sweet, putrid odor he couldn't place, like old flowers left in stagnant water. He set his pack down on one of the platforms, the wood creaking under the weight. He methodically set up his camp, sleeping bag on the other platform, away from the door, stove near the fireplace for cooking, camera on tripod pointed to cover the doorway, and the interior, digital recorder placed centrally on the floor. His actions were rote, a ritual to ward off the crushing sense of intrusion he felt. This was not a place for the living. Every scrape of his gear, every rustle of his jacket was an affront to a profound and settled silence. As dusk began to seep into the glen, turning the loch from black to a deeper, more profound shade of void, he felt the first true stirring of dread. It was different from the jump scares of Urquhart, or the intellectual terror of the disappearing path. This was a slow, sinking feeling, a certainty that he had crossed a line. The warnings hadn't been about danger, they had been about violation. He was not just spending the night in a haunted place, he was spending the night in a place that had consumed lives and offered no explanation, a place that had been given back to the silence by a community too afraid to claim it. He ate a tasteless meal, his ears straining. The silence was no longer empty, it was a medium, a substance. It felt charged, watchful. He lit a single battery-powered lantern, its lead glow a harsh modern insult to the ancient gloom. He turned it low. Sitting on the edge of the sleeping platform, journal open but pen still, he waited. The chronicle had brought him to the threshold. The final encounter lay in the hours ahead, in the dark heart of the night at the Lake of the Dark Center. He had come to document the phenomena, but as the last of the grey light died at the window, leaving only the reflection of his feeble lamp in the glass, he knew, with a cold, clinical clarity, that tonight he would not be just the chronicler. He would be the subject. The bothy had had enough visitors. Now it had one more, and it waited, with a patience as deep and cold as the loch outside, for the dark to claim him too. The dark that filled the bothy was not an absence of light, but a presence. It had weight and texture, a velvety blackness that seemed to absorb the feeble glow of Alistair's lantern, reducing it to a pathetic, shrinking island on the earthen floor. He sat on the edge of the sleeping platform, his back against the cold stone wall, the rough wool of his sleeping bag wrapped around his shoulders. The silence was no longer passive. It was a held breath, a listening stillness. The digital recorder's red light glowed like a single watchful eye. The camera on its tripod was a blind sentinel pointed at the door. For the first hour, there was only the creeping cold and the thunder of his own heartbeat in his ears. He fought the urge to check his watch, to break the spell with a mundane gesture. He focused on his breathing, on the solid feel of the journal in his lap. He was the chronicler. He was here to observe. Then the shadows began to move. It started at the periphery of the lantern's reach. A patch of darkness in the corner near the fireplace seemed to thicken, to detach itself from the wall. It slid, soundless, along the join of floor and stone, flowing like spilled ink. It had no defined shape, but its motion was deliberate, exploratory. As it moved, the temperature in the bothy dropped sharply. Alistair's breath plumed in the air, a white ghost in the gloom. He stared, frozen, as a second shadow peeled away from the area around the small window, this one taller, more vertical. It didn't walk, it unfolded, extending upwards until it brushed the low ceiling. A sound began, so low it was felt more than heard, a vibration through the packed earth floor. It was a chant or the memory of one. Not words, but a rhythmic, guttural murmur, a chorus of voices speaking in unison from a vast distance. It seemed to emanate from the stones themselves, from the black water of the loch outside, seeping through the walls. The murmur held no language he recognized, only a cadence of ancient communal dread. It was the sound of a ritual without end, a ceremony performed for an audience long turned to dust. Alistair's hand, trembling, found the pen. He could not write. He could only watch as the shadows multiplied. They were not just in the corners now, they were coalescing in the center of the room, swirling like smoke in a draftless space, drawing together. The murmur rose in volume, not to a shout, but to a pervasive buzzing drone that filled his skull, pressing against his temples. The cold became agonizing, a deep, marrow-freezing chill that made his joints ache. And then they took shape. The swirling shadows solidified into figures. 4 of them. They were translucent, grey as the mist outside, but their forms were unmistakably human, young. They wore the ghostly impressions of modern hiking gear, fleece jackets, boots, backpacks that seemed to weigh nothing. They stood in a loose circle in the middle of the room, facing inward, their heads bowed. They were not the campers as they had lived. They were impressions of them in their final, terrible moment. Alistair's breath caught in his throat. This was not a replay of a violent struggle. There was no panic in their posture. There was only a profound, empty resignation. One of the figures, a young man with the faint suggestion of glasses, slowly raised his head. He did not look at Alistair. He looked through him, his eye sockets dark voids. His mouth opened, and a sound emerged, not from him but from the air around him. A soft, bewildered sigh that was not a word, but the essence of confusion. The other figures began to mimic the movement, their heads lifting in unison as if pulled by strings. Their mouths opened in silent chorus. The droning chant in the background shifted, weaving into their silent cry, becoming a dirge. The figures began to turn, not to face Alistair, but to face the 4 walls of the bothy, each one orienting to a different direction. They raised their hands, palms outward, pressing them against the cold stone as if feeling for something or holding something back. Then the true horror began. The stone walls behind them started to bleed darkness, not shadows, but a deeper blackness, a liquid night that seeped from the mortar, pooling on the floor and rising like a tide. It was the darkness of the loch, of the cave the loch was named for, of a depth that had no bottom. The chanting rose to a fever pitch, a frantic, desperate rhythm. The 4 figures began to shudder, their translucent forms vibrating as if being shaken apart by the sound. Their silent mouths were now stretched in screams that produced no noise, only a vacuum of sound that pulled at the air in the room. Alistair felt a pressure building inside his own skull, a psychic suction trying to draw his thoughts out through his eyes, his mouth. He understood, in a flash of pure, wordless terror, what had happened here. It wasn't exposure, or poison, or illness. This place, this lonely loch in its stone bowl, was a sinkhole, not for water, but for spirit. The ancient murmur, the chanting darkness, was a presence that fed on consciousness, on the vital spark of the living. It had called to the campers, not with malice, but with a hungry, empty need, and in their isolated, vulnerable state, it had simply siphoned them. It had drawn their selves out, leaving their bodies as empty shells, and absorbed their terror, their confusion, their final moments into its own eternal chanting memory. The four figures were now dissolving, not fading, but being unwoven. Strands of their grey essence were being pulled from their forms, drawn into the seeping blackness on the walls. They were being recycled into the haunt, their individual tragedies becoming fuel for the endless hungry ritual. This was the depth of the horror. This was not a ghost trapped in a moment. This was a place that consumed ghosts, that used human despair as a perpetual engine. The black tide reached Alistair's boots. A numbness, not cold but a terrifying absence of feeling, began to creep up his legs. The chanting was inside him now, vibrating in his teeth, replacing his thoughts with its monotonous ancient rhythm. He saw, in the swirling darkness, fleeting images. Not just the four campers, but others. A figure in old tweed, a woman in a long skirt, fragments of souls from decades, centuries past, all drawn here and unraveled into the chorus. His sanity, a thin, frayed thread, began to snap. The rational chronicler was gone. What remained was pure animal instinct, a shrieking need to flee. With a gasp that tore at his frozen lungs, he launched himself from the platform. He stumbled through the swirling grey figures, his body passing through a chill that felt like diving into a grave. He snatched the camera and recorder, not caring about evidence, only needing to break their connection to this place. He threw himself at the door. It wouldn't open. The wood was ice cold, fused to its frame by the creeping dark. He slammed his shoulder against it, once, twice, a sob of raw panic escaping his lips. Behind him, the chanting reached a crescendo. He felt a tug at his back, a psychic hook trying to set in his mind. He turned and saw the four figures had fully dissolved. In their place, the seeping blackness on the walls had formed into a single shapeless maw in the center of the room, a vortex of silent, screaming faces and chanting darkness pulling at him. With a final, desperate scream that was swallowed by the drone, he kicked at the door near the latch. The old wood splintered. He burst out into the night. The cold air of the glen felt like a furnace compared to the deathly chill inside. He did not look back. He ran, scrambling up the slope away from the loch, his pack forgotten, his mind a white blank of terror. The chanting faded, replaced by the roar of blood in his ears and the ragged saw of his breath. He ran until his legs buckled, collapsing into a patch of freezing heather. He curled into a ball, shaking uncontrollably, not from cold, but from the aftermath of a violation he could not name. When dawn came, a grey, sickly light that did nothing to warm the world, he was still there. He forced himself to stand, his body protesting. He looked down at the bothy. It sat innocently by the black loch, a quiet stone hut. No shadows moved at the window. No sound emerged. He stumbled back to his car on numb legs, a journey that took twice as long as the approach, every shadow in the heather a potential tendril of the dark. He did not play the recorder. He did not check the camera. He knew what they would contain, and the knowledge was a poison. Driving away, the familiar landscapes of the Highlands unspooled before him, but they were forever changed. He had peered into the heart of the haunting, and it was not a story. It was a machine, an ancient, hungry thing that fed on the loneliness and fear it helped create. The final encounter had shown him the truth. Some places are not just haunted by the dead, they are themselves alive with a kind of anti-life, a void that wears the faces of its victims to lure in more. He had barely escaped with his sanity, but he had left a part of himself in that bothy, the part that believed he could be a mere observer. He was not. He was prey that had gotten away, and the memory of the chanting dark would live inside him now, a cold, silent companion on the road home. The flat in Inverness was a stranger's home. The familiar clutter of books and maps, the worn armchair by the electric fire, the view of the rain-slicked street and the distant grey river, all of it felt like a diorama of a life he had left behind months ago. Alistair stood in the doorway, his backpack slumped at his feet like a dead thing, the keys cold in his hand. The silence here was different. It was the silence of empty rooms, of central heating and refrigerator hum, a thin modern quiet that could not mask the deeper, older silence he now carried within him. He had returned, but he had not come back. For days, he moved through the rooms like a ghost himself. He unpacked with a methodical, numb detachment. His gear, once symbols of adventure, now felt like artifacts from a battlefield. The mud-caked boots from the disappearing path, the cold-gripped camera from Urquhart, the digital recorder that held the phantom train's scream. He cleaned them, stored them away, but their presence lingered in the cupboard like a guilty secret. The small stone from the river Ness still sat on the dashboard of his parked car. He could not bring himself to touch it. It was no longer a talisman, but a paperweight holding down a stack of nightmares. The work began, as it always did, with the notes. He spread his journals, his voice memos, his photographs across the large desk by the window. The physical evidence of his journey was overwhelming. Hundreds of pages of handwriting, thousands of digital files. He had sought to create a chronicle, and he had succeeded. But as he began to compile, to transcribe, to organize, the true pattern emerged not as an academic thesis, but as a slow, chilling revelation. Sitting for hours in the pale northern light that filtered through the window, he pieced together the tapestry of terror. It was not a random collection of spooky stories. It was a map of suffering. Each haunting was a scar on the landscape, a psychic wound that had never healed. The Highlands, in all their brutal beauty, were not just a place where people had died tragically. They were a place where tragedy had become a permanent resident. The land did not forget. It absorbed the shock of loss, the spike of fear, the slow bleed of despair, and it played these memories back under the right conditions, in the mist, in the dark, in the lonely silence. The ghosts were not intruders in the world of the living. They were echoes, vibrations from the past that had become trapped in the very fabric of place, replaying their final painful moments on a loop for eternity. He wrote this realization into the introduction of his manuscript, his prose colder, sharper than the enthusiastic travelogue he had originally envisioned. Echoes in the Heather became less a guidebook to haunted sites and more a meditation on landscape as a repository of pain. He described the whispering loneliness of Glen Coe, the collective trauma of Culloden, the sedimentary sorrow of Skara Brae. He wrote of the bothy by the dark loch, with a clinical distance that barely contained the tremor in his hand as he typed, referring to it only as a remote shelter in the Monadleaths, and describing the oppressive atmosphere and local folklore of misfortune. The full truth of that night was a black hole in the center of the narrative, a silence more eloquent than any words he could set down. To describe the chanting dark, the unraveling figures, would be to risk pulling readers into the vacuum he had felt. Some knowledge was a contagion. The book was published to modest acclaim. Reviewers called it atmospheric, deeply researched, chillingly persuasive. A few questioned his psychological interpretations, but none could dismiss the cumulative weight of the testimony and the evidence, the audio from Glenfinnan, the photographs from Urquhart and Dunatar. He gave interviews, his voice steady, his answers measured. He spoke of folklore and geology, of auditory pareidolia and the psychology of isolation. He was the rational chronicler, the man who had walked into the haunted dark and walked back out with a story. The public face was a mask, expertly crafted. Behind it, the man was shattered, for the hauntings did not stay in the Highlands. They followed him home. Not as apparitions, his flat remained stubbornly, blessedly free of spectral women or whispering stones, but as sensations, as fractures in his perception of the world. The central heating's hum could sometimes drop into the droning register of the bothy's chant, and he would freeze, his coffee cooling forgotten in his hand, until the sound resolved back into machinery. A sudden fog over the river would trigger a visceral, panicky claustrophobia, the memory of a voice calling his name from a luminous grey void. He took to sleeping with a light on, the darkness of his bedroom too reminiscent of the absolute hungry black of the Loch Nan Dearg bothy. He was forever changed. The easy curiosity that had launched his journey was gone, replaced by a permanent, low-grade vigilance. Crowds could overwhelm him with their simple, unhaunted normality. Solitude could tip into a sense of being watched by something older than the walls around him. He found himself studying the corners of rooms, not expecting to see anything, but feeling the potential for something to coalesce there, in the join of shadow and wall. The world had become thin, a fragile film over a deeper, darker reality where memories refused to die and places hungered. The success of the book meant he was asked about a sequel. He refused, politely, firmly. The chronicle was complete. To go back, to seek out more echoes, would be to risk the tenuous hold he had on his own sanity. He had learned the final terrible lesson: some memories are not meant to be heard, some doors are not meant to be opened. The Highlands held their ghosts close, not as entertainment, but as a warning. A reminder that the past is not a country we visit, but a layer of the present, and in those lonely, wind-scoured places, the layer is worn perilously thin. Alistair MacLeod still lives in Inverness. He writes, but on different subjects now. He takes long walks, but never at dusk, and never into the deep glens. Sometimes, on a very clear night, he will look north towards the mountains, their silhouettes black against the starry sky. They are no longer beautiful to him. They are keepers, guardians of 1,000 silent stories, of echoes that will never fade. He is a man who went looking for ghosts and found instead the terrible truth that the land remembers, and that some memories, once witnessed, become a part of you. He is a chronicler who became an entry in his own ledger, forever haunted not by what he saw, but by the understanding of what lies, patient and hungry, in the quiet places of the world.